You're going to die if you stay. Then I'll die trying. Lena Carter couldn't hear the roar of the flames swallowing the truck beside her, but she felt the heat crawling up her arms like a living thing, and she didn't move. She grabbed the beam. She pulled. Somewhere behind her, a 260-pound biker known across 3 states as Iron Jack Mason was screaming her name, and she couldn't hear that either. She just kept pulling. Before we go further, if stories like this one keep you glued to your seat, hit that subscribe button right now and don't go anywhere, because this journey is only getting started. And do me a favor, drop a comment below and tell me what city you are watching from tonight. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. Lena Carter had learned a long time ago that the world did not wait for anyone to catch up. She was 22 years old, and she had been born into silence, not the peaceful kind people sometimes wish for, not the silence of a quiet Sunday morning, but the total permanent absence of sound that had defined every single day of her life. She didn't remember what her mother's voice sounded like because she had never heard it. She didn't remember birds or rain or the particular hush of a library because none of those things had ever reached her. What she had instead was a razor-sharp pair of hands that spoke faster than most people's mouths, and a stubbornness that her physical therapist, a tired but kind woman named Carol, liked to call borderline reckless. Carol wasn't wrong, but Carol also didn't know what it was like to watch your own legs betray you a little more each month. Lena had a condition the doctors called a degenerative peripheral nerve disorder, the kind of diagnosis that sounded almost gentle written down on paper and felt like a slow-motion earthquake in real life. Her balance had started slipping 2 years ago, first just a stumble here and there, easy to laugh off, easy to blame on tired legs or bad shoes. Then it became her right foot dragging slightly when she walked too fast. Then it became falling in the grocery store, in front of strangers who stared and said nothing. Because of course they said nothing, because words had never been part of her world to begin with. Only their faces, their pity, their discomfort. The only thing standing between Lena and a wheelchair, a real permanent, unforgiving wheelchair, was a surgery. A very specific, very expensive surgery that a specialist in Los Angeles had described to her in painstaking written notes because there was no interpreter available that day. $150,000. Not covered by her insurance, not even close. She had done the math so many times she had memorized every zero. She worked 2 jobs, one at a print shop that appreciated her more than most places did because her hands were fast and her eyes never missed a misaligned label, and one on weekends walking dogs for a wealthy older couple in Scottsdale who tipped well and never made her feel broken. She had saved $11,000 in 2 years. At that rate, she would need the surgery before she could ever afford it, which was its own cruel little joke that she had stopped finding funny a long time ago. That Saturday afternoon, the Arizona heat set on the desert like something solid, something you could lean against. Lena was driving her secondhand Honda Civic, a car with a check engine light that had been on so long it felt like part of the dashboard's personality down the long stretch of Highway 87 toward Payson, where she was supposed to meet Carol for a physical therapy session that had been rescheduled twice already. Her hands rested loosely on the wheel. Her eyes moved constantly, the way they always did, scanning mirrors, scanning the road ahead, scanning everything, because her ears would never do that job for her. So her eyes had learned to do double duty a long time ago. She noticed the trucks before most drivers would have. There were 2 of them. One was an 18-wheeler hauling some kind of industrial freight, moving steady in the right lane about a quarter mile ahead of her. The other was smaller, a box truck, dark green, no company markings that she could see, and it was moving strangely. Not swerving exactly. Not drunk driving, strange. Something more deliberate. It kept pacing itself alongside a cluster of motorcycles that had entered the highway. From the last exit, 6 of them riding in tight formation. Black leather glinting under the sun patches on their backs that Lena couldn't read from this distance, but recognized the shape of. Everyone in Arizona recognized that winged skull shape, whether they'd ever spoken to a member of the club or not. Lena's grip on the wheel tightened, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Something about the box truck's movement itched at the back of her mind. It didn't look like it was trying to pass the bikers. It looked like it was matching their speed, watching them, waiting. She eased off the weight instinctively, letting more distance open up between her Civic and the vehicles ahead, the way you might step back from a stove that hadn't started smoking yet, but somehow already smelled wrong. Then the box truck moved. It didn't drift. It didn't lose control. It turned hard and sudden and absolutely intentional, cutting directly into the motorcycle formation like a blade dropped into water. Lena's whole body went rigid. She couldn't hear the impact, the shriek of metal, the scream of tires, the first motorcycle catapulting sideways in a spray of chrome and asphalt. But she felt it. She felt it in her chest, in the vibration that traveled up through the road and into her tires and up through the frame of her own car, a violence so total that her body understood it as sound even when her ears never would. Her foot slammed the brake before her mind had finished processing what her eyes had just recorded. The highway ahead dissolved into chaos. One rider was thrown clear, tumbling across the shoulder in a way that no human body was built to tumble. Another motorcycle folded beneath the box truck's undercarriage with an ugly grinding finality. The truck itself didn't stop. It kept going for another 20-30 yards before finally veering off the road, entirely crashing through a low guardrail and slamming into an embankment where seconds later something inside it ignited. Lena watched, frozen for one single unbearable heartbeat, as flame bloomed along the truck's undercarriage and began climbing. Other cars were stopping now. She could see it in her peripheral vision, brake lights flaring red up and down the highway doors, opening, people spilling out onto the shoulder mouths, open in what she understood without needing to hear. It were screams. Nobody was running toward the fire. They stood at the edges, phones raised, some of them filming instead of moving the way people so often did, when their bodies simply refused to process the size of the danger in front of them. Lena understood that hesitation. She had felt it herself once years ago watching a car accident on a different road, and she had frozen, too ashamed of her own stillness for weeks afterward. She was not going to freeze this time. She threw the Civic into park, barely bothering to pull fully onto the shoulder, and was out the door before she had consciously decided to open it. Heat slapped her in the face immediately, real heat furnace heat, the kind that made the air itself seem to shimmer and bend. She could see close to the burning truck a shape on the ground, a large shape, a man pinned beneath something, one arm raised weakly, fingers curling and uncurling against the asphalt like he was trying to claw his way out of his own body. A woman near Lena's mouth, moving fast, panicked, grabbed her arm as she moved past. Lena couldn't hear what the woman was saying, but she read the shape of the words on her lips easily enough. Don't, it's too dangerous. Wait for help. Lena pulled her arm free and kept moving. She had spent her entire life being told to wait. Wait for someone to notice her raised hand in a classroom that never had an interpreter fast enough. Wait for a doctor's office to find someone who could sign. Wait for her turn, her chance, her moment, always somewhere down the line, always contingent on someone else's convenience. She was done waiting. There was a man on fire functionally in every way that mattered, and the world around her had chosen paralysis. She would not. The closer she got, the worse the heat became, until it felt like something solid pressing against her skin, until she could see the shimmer of it distorting the air above the wreckage. She could see the man clearly now, enormous, easily, 6.5 feet. He'd been standing built like something out of an old Western, with a gray beard soaked dark with blood and sweat, and a leather vest sleeveless, thick with patches, pinned beneath a twisted chunk of the truck's engine block that had been thrown clear in the initial impact. His eyes found her as she approached. Even through the pain etched across every line of his face, something sharpened in his expression, recognition of what she was doing, and immediate furious rejection of it. His mouth moved. Get back. Get away from here. Run. Lena shook her head once hard and dropped to her knees beside him, ignoring the way the asphalt burned even through her jeans. The engine block was too heavy to lift. With her hands alone, she understood that instantly, the way her body understood weight and leverage. Even when her ears couldn't help, her understand danger through sound. Her eyes swept the wreckage frantically until she found what she needed, a length of pipe torn loose from somewhere in the crash, long enough to give her leverage strong enough she hoped not to bend. She grabbed it and wedged one end beneath the lip of the engine block, positioning her body weight against the other end, the way she'd seen mechanics do 100 times at the print shop's loading dock, where trucks sometimes needed cargo shifted by hand when the lift was broken. The man's mouth was moving again more urgently now, and this time Lena didn't need to read lips to understand the message because his hand had found her wrist and was pushing her away, pushing her back from him with more strength than a dying man should have had. She pulled her wrist free and threw her entire body weight down onto the pipe. Nothing happened for one agonizing second. Then the engine block groaned, shifted an inch, then two. Sweat streamed into her eyes. Her arms screamed with effort. Somewhere behind her, she felt more than heard the whoosh of the fire. Finding new fuel, felt the vibration of it in her back teeth, in her sternum, a physical pressure that told her with total clarity that time was running out faster than her body could move. The engine block shifted a third time enough. Lena dropped the pipe and grabbed the man under his arms, hooking her hands beneath his shoulders, and pulled with everything her smaller frame had left in it. He was too heavy. She knew that logically in the part of her brain that still had room for logic. 260 pounds of dead weight against 130 pounds of exhausted 22-year-old should not have moved an inch. But something in him understood what she was doing, and even broken, even trapped beneath crushing pain, he found some reserve of strength in his uninjured leg and pushed, helping her drag him those last brutal few feet away from the truck's undercarriage. His mouth was still moving. She caught fragments of it, this time close enough now to read clearly. "It's going to blow. Leave me. Go." Now, Lena didn't leave. She got her shoulder under his arm, hauling him another few feet, her muscles trembling, her vision swimming with heat and exertion, and she felt it before she saw it. A change in pressure, a shift in the air itself, a warning her body understood on some ancient animal level, even without sound to confirm it. She threw herself over him. The truck exploded. The force of it lifted her off the ground and slammed her back down onto the asphalt. And for one white, silent, endless moment, there was nothing at all. No heat, no pain, no fear. Just a total and complete absence that felt almost peaceful, almost kind, before the world came crashing back in through a body that no longer wanted to cooperate. The last thing Lena registered before the darkness folded over her completely was the enormous man beneath her, one massive arm wrapped instinctively around her back, shielding her from debris, even as he himself lay broken and burned, and his mouth moving one final time, shaping words she would only understand hours later when someone finally wrote them down for her on a hospital notepad. You didn't have to do that, but you did. When Lena's eyes opened again, the world was white and sterile and impossibly bright, and for a long moment she didn't know where she was or how much time had passed or whether the man she'd pulled from the fire was even alive. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands were bandaged. There was a dull, persistent throb along her hairline where she must have hit the pavement, and when she tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness rolled through her so violently that she had to grip the bed rail just to keep from sliding sideways. A nurse noticed her stirring and hurried over, mouth moving, fast, too fast. The way people's mouths always moved when they forgot, in the panic of a medical emergency, that Lena couldn't simply hear them slow down. Lena raised one bandaged hand weakly and signed as clearly as her trembling fingers, loud, "I'm deaf." "Write it down, please." The nurse's expression shifted apology, understanding the particular scramble of someone realizing they needed a different approach, and she grabbed a notepad from the tray beside the bed. "You're at Verde Valley Medical Center. You were in an accident on Highway 87. You have second-degree burns on your hands and forearms, a mild concussion and bruised ribs. You're going to be okay." Lena read the words twice, her mind still catching up, fragments of memory surfacing in disjointed pieces. The box truck's deliberate turn the fire, the massive man pinned beneath the engine block, his mouth shaping the word "run" over and over while she ignored him completely. She grabbed the notepad back and wrote her handwriting, shaky but legible. "The man, the biker. Is he alive?" The nurse hesitated just a flicker, just long enough for Lena's stomach to drop before writing, "He's alive. Critical but stable. You saved his life. Everyone's talking about it." Relief hit Lena so hard and so fast that her eyes burned with sudden tears, and she had to look away toward the window, toward the flat gray light of early evening, pressing against the glass, just to keep herself from falling apart completely in front of a stranger. She didn't know his name. She didn't know anything about him beyond the shape of his desperate warnings and the weight of his arm curling around her in the half-second before the explosion. But something about knowing he was alive settled a piece of her chest that had been clenched tight since the moment she'd thrown herself over him. It was almost an hour later, after a doctor had come and gone, after they'd checked her pupils and her reflexes, and confirmed with visible relief that her concussion was mild, and her burns, while painful, wouldn't require skin grafts, that a man appeared in her doorway who did not look like hospital staff at all. He was tall, lean rather than bulky, with a shaved head and a neatly trimmed goatee, and the same style of leather vest the burned man had been wearing, patches and all, Though his read slightly differently up close, a position, a rank something Lena didn't have the context to interpret yet. His eyes swept the room once, taking in every corner, every exit, with the kind of practiced awareness that suggested this was not his first time walking into a hospital under difficult circumstances. He knocked once on the door frame out of what seemed like genuine habit rather than necessity and waited until Lena's eyes found him before stepping inside. He held up a small whiteboard, already prepared, already written on, and Lena's chest tightened at the realization that someone had thought to prepare this specifically for her. My name is Tommy. Everyone calls me Reaper. I work with Jack the man you pulled out of that fire. He wants to thank you himself. Is that okay? Lena studied the man's face for a long moment. There was something guarded in his expression, something calculating beneath the politeness, though she couldn't tell yet whether that calculation was aimed at her or simply at the situation itself. She nodded slowly and signed, I'm Lena, deaf since birth. You'll need to write things down or face me directly when you talk. Reaper read her signs imperfectly. She could tell, sounding out the shapes rather than fluently understanding them. But he got the gist and gave a short nod before writing back, got it. He's 2 doors down, not supposed to have visitors yet, but the nurses aren't going to stop us. There was something in the way he wrote, aren't going to stop us. A quiet, absolute confidence that told Lena more about who these men were than any patch or vest ever could. She let him help her into a wheelchair, her legs still too unsteady and her ribs too bruised to risk walking the short distance herself, and he pushed her the 2 doors down the hallway with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous with the hard lines of his face and the ink covering both his forearms. The room they entered was heavier with medical equipment than her own monitors beeping in patterns she couldn't hear, but could see reflected in their flashing lights an IV-line oxygen tubing, and in the center of it all, propped up against pillows with bandages wrapped thick around his torso and one leg elevated in a brace, was the man from the highway. Up close, without fire and smoke and chaos distorting everything, Lena could finally see him clearly. He looked to be in his early 50s, with a thick gray beard, trimmed close gray hair, pushed back from a face weathered by decades of sun and road, and judging by the scars visible along his jaw and forearms, considerably more danger than the average 50-year-old man encountered. His eyes, when they found Lena in the doorway, went through several rapid shifts of emotion, surprise, then something that looked almost like disbelief, and finally settling into something steadier. A kind of raw, unguarded gratitude that made him look for just a moment far younger than his years. He gestured for the whiteboard Reaper was carrying, and Reaper handed it over along with a marker, watching as the big man wrote with a hand still shaking slightly from pain medication and blood loss. They tell me you're the reason I'm alive. Lena read it, then looked up at him and signed slowly, deliberately watching his face to see if he understood any of it at all. You didn't have to protect me. In the explosion, you could have just run. Reaper, standing beside the bed, translated haltingly, stumbling over a few of the signs but getting close enough that the big man's expression shifted again, understanding then something fierce and immediate that had nothing to do with his injuries. He grabbed the whiteboard back and wrote quickly, pressing hard enough that the marker squeaked against the surface. I don't leave people who put themselves in the fire for me. Not ever. My name is Jack, Victor Mason. But everybody calls me Iron Jack. Lena felt something settle in her chest at the name, at the weight and certainty behind it, though she couldn't have explained exactly why. She signed back, and this time Reaper translated more carefully, taking his time. I'm Lena Carter. I just did what anyone should have done. Jack's expression when Reaper finished translating was almost fierce in its disagreement. He wrote, nobody else moved. You saw that, didn't you? Dozens of people standing there, and you were the only one who ran toward the fire. Lena didn't have an answer for that, not really. Not one that fit neatly onto a whiteboard or into a few quick hand signs. The truth was complicated. It had something to do with a lifetime of being told to wait her turn, something to do with the particular fury of watching other people freeze, while someone suffered, something to do with the strange, clarifying silence of her own world that sometimes made chaos feel almost peaceful by comparison. A problem to be solved rather than a sound to be feared. She simply signed, I couldn't just watch. Before Reaper could finish translating even that simple sentence, the door to Jack's room opened again, and a new figure stepped inside, a man in his 40s, wearing a rumpled sport coat over a badge clipped at his belt, his expression already arranged into the particular blend of authority and impatience that Lena had learned over years of dealing with institutions that weren't built for people like her, usually meant trouble. Reaper's entire demeanor shifted the instant the man walked in, his shoulders squaring, his expression hardening into something guarded and cold. And Jack, even flat on his back, with half his body in bandages, seemed to bristle with a tension that hadn't been there a moment before. The man flashed a badge briefly, more out of habit than necessity, and his eyes moved from Jack to Lena with an expression that carried the faintest, almost imperceptible flicker of something Lena couldn't quite name. Not quite hostility, not quite indifference, but something colder than simple professional curiosity. He pulled out a small notebook and looked directly at Lena, speaking slowly and clearly enough that she could read his lips without much difficulty, though the deliberate slowness itself felt slightly condescending, the way people sometimes overcorrected once they learned she was deaf, as though volume and pace were the same obstacle. "Miss Carter, I'm Detective Aaron Miller. I need to ask you a few questions about what you saw out on 87. Lena nodded, reaching for the small notepad on her bedside tray, ready to write out everything she remembered: the box truck's strange pacing alongside the motorcycles, the sudden violent turn, the deliberate nature of the collision that had felt, even in the chaos of the moment, unmistakably intentional rather than accidental. She wrote quickly, "The truck didn't lose control. It turned into them on purpose. I saw it clearly before I even got close." Miller read the note, and something in his expression tightened almost imperceptibly before smoothing back into practiced neutrality. He wrote back on his own pad, turning it so she could read, "You just witnessed a traumatic explosion and were likely disoriented. These things often look intentional in the moment, but investigation typically shows driver error, mechanical failure, or environmental factors." Lena felt a flare of frustration rise in her chest, sharp and immediate. She grabbed the pad back and wrote, pressing hard enough to nearly tear the paper, "I saw the truck pace itself next to the bikes for almost a mile before it turned. That's not an accident. That's not driver error. I know what I saw." Miller's expression for just a fraction of a second betrayed something, a flicker of irritation quickly suppressed before he offered her a thin professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wrote, "We'll certainly look into every possibility. Thank you for your statement, Miss Carter. You should focus on your recovery." He turned to leave without waiting for her response, and Lena watched his back with a growing uneasy certainty that something about his dismissal had been too fast, too smooth, too eager to close a door that should have still been wide open. The moment Miller was gone, Reaper moved to shut the door firmly behind him, and Jack, watching the exchange from his bed with sharp, alert eyes despite the pain, medication clearly working through his system, grabbed the whiteboard again and wrote with a new, harder urgency, "That man is not going to help you. Reaper, get over here. She needs to know." Reaper hesitated, glancing toward the door as though making sure it was fully closed before crouching down beside Lena's wheelchair so he could speak directly to her face, forming his words slowly and clearly. "That crash wasn't random, Lena. That truck was targeting Jack specifically. We've had threats for weeks. Cartel business moving through territory that used to be neutral. Jack refused to let them run product through Angel Land." Lena's stomach dropped a cold, sick lurch that had nothing to do with her injuries. She signed slowly, needing him to understand fully. The detective knows this. Reaper's jaw tightened, and he glanced once more at Jack, some silent understanding passing between them before he answered. "Jack's convinced Miller's on somebody's payroll. Too many accidents happening to people who cross the wrong folks around here, and every single time Miller's the one writing it up as nothing. We've suspected it for a while, now we're sure." Lena felt the room tilt slightly, though this time it had nothing to do with her concussion. She had gone from witness to something else entirely in the space of a single sentence, from a bystander who happened to see something terrible to the one person alive who could contradict whatever official story someone was already working hard to construct. She signed, her hands moving faster now, driven by a fear that was cutting cleanly through the fog of pain medication and exhaustion. "If I'm the only witness who says it wasn't an accident and the detective wants it called an accident, what happens to me?" Reaper didn't answer immediately. He looked at Jack instead, and Jack, despite the bandages and the brace and the visible strain of every small movement, pushed himself up slightly against his pillows, his eyes locking onto Lena's, with an intensity that needed no translation at all. He grabbed the whiteboard and wrote 3 words, pressing the marker down so hard it nearly split the tip. "Nothing happens. Ever." Then beneath it in smaller but no less certain handwriting, "You're one of ours now, whether you like it or not." Lena stared at the words for a long moment, feeling something complicated unfold in her chest. Gratitude and fear and a strange, unfamiliar warmth at being claimed so fiercely by a man she'd known for less than a day, a man whose entire world seemed built around loyalty and violence in equal measure. Before she could sign a response, the monitors beside Jack's bed let out a visible flurry of flashing lights, numbers spiking on the small screen, in a pattern that made Reaper's head snap toward it, immediately his relaxed posture vanishing in an instant. Jack's face had gone pale, sweat breaking out along his hairline. His breathing suddenly labored in a way that even Lena, without hearing a single gasp, could read clearly in the desperate rise and fall of his chest, and the way his hand clutched suddenly at the blanket. Reaper was at the door in 2 strides, yanking it open and waving frantically down the hallway, and within seconds a team of nurses and a doctor came rushing in, pushing Lena's wheelchair back out of the way with hurried, urgent hands as they surrounded Jack's bed, working with the kind of focused speed that told Lena, without needing a single word, that something had gone seriously wrong. She watched, helpless and terrified, as the medical team worked over him, as Reaper stood pressed against the wall with his fists clenched and his face carved from stone, and as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the frantic energy in the room finally gradually began to settle. A doctor finally turned toward the doorway, where a small crowd of leather-clad, heavily tattooed men had begun gathering more of Jack's people, drawn by whatever alert system moved through their world, their expressions ranging from grim to openly hostile as they watched the medical staff work. The doctor's mouth moved, and Reaper translated quickly for Lena, his hands shaking slightly with residual adrenaline, internal bleeding from the crash. "They almost missed it. He needs emergency surgery right now." Lena watched them wheel Jack's bed out of the room at a near run, his eyes finding hers for just one brief, fierce second before he disappeared through the double doors at the end of the hallway, and something in that single glance, determination, refusal, and absolute unwillingness to be finished, yet settled deep into her chest and stayed there. The hallway outside filled quickly with more members of the club, word spreading fast through whatever network these men had built over years of loyalty and shared danger, and Lena found herself surrounded by strangers who nonetheless treated her with a strange immediate reverence. Several of them nodding toward her, one older man with a gray ponytail, placing a hand briefly and respectfully over his heart as he passed her wheelchair. She didn't fully understand yet what she had stepped into. She only understood that the world had shifted beneath her in the space of one terrible afternoon, that a highway accident had become something far larger and far more dangerous, and that somewhere behind steel doors down that hallway, a man was fighting for his life. A second time in the same day, a man who had, in the middle of his own agony, still found the strength to shield her body with his own. Hours passed. Lena was eventually wheeled back to her own room, though she refused, despite the nurse's gentle insistence, to actually sleep. Her eyes fixed instead on the door, waiting for any sign, any update, any indication of whether the man who had called her one of his own was going to survive the night. It was well past midnight, according to the clock on the wall, when Reaper finally appeared in her doorway again, and the moment Lena saw his face, she felt her chest loosen slightly. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the absence of the devastation she had been bracing herself for. He held up the whiteboard, and this time his handwriting was less steady exhaustion, clearly working through him as thoroughly as it was working through her. "Surgery went okay. He's stable. Not out of the woods yet, but he's fighting." Lena closed her eyes briefly, feeling something in her chest unclench for the first time in hours. And when she opened them again, Reaper was still watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something more open, less guarded in assessment that seemed to be settling into something like respect. He wrote one more line before turning to leave, his hand pausing on the doorframe as though he wanted to make sure she read it fully before he disappeared down the hallway to keep his vigil outside the ICU. "Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone. Not anymore." Lena read the words twice, then set the whiteboard down on her lap, staring at the dark window across from her bed at her own faint reflection, ghosting back at her against the glass, bandaged, bruised, exhausted, and somehow, despite everything, still alive, still breathing, still herself. Outside that hospital, she knew a truck had been deliberately steered into a convoy of motorcycles in broad daylight on a public highway. A detective with a badge had already tried to bury the truth before it had even fully surfaced, and a man built like a mountain had risked his last conscious moments shielding her body from an explosion instead of thinking of himself. Nothing about her life was going to look the same after this. She understood that now with a clarity that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with the particular silence in which she'd lived her entire life. A silence that had taught her better than any spoken warning ever could to trust the things she could feel far more than the things people tried to tell her. And what she felt now, sitting alone in a hospital bed with bandaged hands and a body that ached in every direction, was not fear. It was resolve. Somewhere down that hallway behind the steel doors and a wall of leather-clad men standing guard, Victor Ironjack Mason was fighting to survive a war that had started the moment a truck turned off its designated lane and aimed itself with brutal and calculated precision at 6 innocent motorcycles on an empty desert highway. And Lena Carter, deaf since birth, exhausted, injured, and utterly unwilling to look away from danger, the way everyone around her seemed to expect, had already decided somewhere deep in the silent, unshakable core of herself that she was not finished either. Not even close. The morning light hadn't even fully broken through the blinds of Lena's hospital room when the door opened without a knock and a woman in scrubs Lena didn't recognize stepped inside, moving with a brisk, unnatural efficiency that made every nerve in Lena's body go taut before the woman had said a single word. She held a small tray, a syringe, a clipboard tucked under one arm. Lena's eyes tracked the syringe, then the woman's face, then the badge clipped to her scrubs, and something about the badge was wrong. Too new. The plastic still had the faint sheen of something recently printed, none of the wear that every other staff badge in this hospital carried after months of use. The woman's mouth moved. "Time for your morning medication, sweetheart." Lena didn't move. She kept her eyes locked on the woman's face, refusing to look away, refusing to make this easy, and she reached slowly for the notepad on her tray instead of holding out her arm the way the woman clearly expected. She wrote, "What medication?" "Nobody told me about this." The woman's smile flickered just barely, just enough before she recovered it, writing quickly on the corner of her own clipboard and turning it toward Lena. "Standard pain management. Doctor's orders. Won't take but a second." Lena's stomach twisted. She had been on this floor for almost 18 hours now. She knew the rhythm of it, knew which nurses came in when, knew the particular efficient warmth of the actual staff who'd been checking her vitals every few hours since the accident. This woman moved differently, watched differently. Her eyes kept flicking toward the door, toward the hallway, the way someone's eyes moved when they were far more interested in who might walk in than in the patient in front of them. Lena reached for the call button clipped to her bed rail. The woman's hand shot out and closed over Lena's wrist before she could press it. And in that single motion, fast, hard, utterly, without the gentleness a real nurse would have used, Lena understood with total certainty that she had been right to be afraid. She didn't scream. She couldn't have heard herself scream, even if she tried, and years of living without that particular tool had taught her to fight with everything else instead. She twisted her wrist free with a sharp, violent motion and slammed her free hand down on the call button at the same moment the door burst open. Reaper filled the doorway, and the change in the fake nurse's face was instant, controlled panic, dropping the professional mask completely, her hand darting toward the tray, toward the syringe, and Reaper crossed the room in 2 strides and had her wrist pinned against the wall before she'd gotten within a foot of Lena's IV line. The syringe clattered to the floor. Real nurses came running, now drawn by the commotion by Lena's frantic slap against the call button. And within seconds, the room was full of raised voices Lena couldn't hear and bodies moving fast. Security appearing from somewhere down the hall, and the fake nurse pinned cornered her cover blown completely, was shouting something at Reaper that made his face go pale with a fury Lena had never seen on a human being before. Security dragged the woman out. Real hospital staff surrounded Lena's bed, checking her IV, line her vitals, mouths moving too fast for her to catch more than fragments. And through all of it, Reaper stood rigid by the door. His jaw locked, his hands still curled into fists at his sides. When the room finally cleared enough for him to reach her, he grabbed the whiteboard with hands that were visibly shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up to him. That syringe wasn't pain medication. Security's testing it now, but I already know. That was meant to stop your heart, Lena. Quiet, clean. They'd have called it a complication from your injuries. Lena stared at the words until they blurred slightly, her own hands trembling now too, the delayed shock of how close death had just come settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She wrote back, her handwriting jagged. They tried to kill me. In a hospital. In the morning. With people everywhere. Reaper's expression when he looked at her held none of the reassurance she desperately wanted from him. Instead, he wrote flat and honest in a way that terrified her more than any comfort could have. That's exactly why they did it here. Nobody expects it here. And they almost got away with it because nobody was watching close enough. Nobody except him. Lena understood with a jolt that Reaper hadn't left this floor all night. He'd been standing vigil somewhere just outside her line of sight, and that vigilance was the only reason she was still breathing. She signed, forcing her hands to stop shaking long enough to form the words, clearly. Is Jack awake? Does he know? Reaper shook his head, then wrote, still in recovery. But I'm calling in more brothers. This just became a whole different situation. Within the hour, Lena's room had transformed into something that looked less like a hospital recovery space and more like a fortified checkpoint. Two enormous men in leather vests took up positions on either side of her door, arms crossed, eyes scanning every person who passed in the hallway with an intensity that made even hospital staff visibly nervous. A third sat in a chair pulled directly beside her bed, close enough to react instantly, his presence a wall of muscle and quiet, coiled readiness. Lena had never in her life felt simultaneously so protected and so profoundly unsettled. A doctor came by mid-morning, a real one this time, her badge worn and faded with genuine use, her hands steady and familiar as she checked Lena's bandages and adjusted her IV. She wrote on the notepad with brisk efficiency, your burns are healing well. Ribs will take a few weeks, but given what happened this morning, hospital administration wants to discuss discharge options as soon as you're medically stable. For your safety and ours. Lena read that twice, feeling something cold settle in her chest. She wrote back, you're kicking me out because someone tried to kill me here. The doctor's face when Lena looked up carried genuine sympathy, but also a kind of helpless honesty. We can't protect you from something like this, Miss Carter. Whoever did this got a fake ID badge past our security. That's not something we can guarantee won't happen again. The man sitting beside Lena's bed, one of the club members heavily built with a shaved head and a neck tattoo she hadn't had the composure to fully examine until now, leaned forward and tapped the doctor's arm gently to get her attention, then made a simple gesture toward himself and toward Lena, a universal signal that needed no translation. We've got her. The doctor seemed to understand immediately, some tension leaving her shoulders, and she nodded, writing one more line before stepping back. Understood. We'll expedite the discharge paperwork. Good luck to you, Miss Carter. Truly. By early afternoon, Reaper returned with news that made the tight muscles in Lena's shoulders finally marginally loosen. Jack was awake, stable, still weak, still tethered to more machines than Lena could count, but conscious and asking for her by name, in a voice so rough from the breathing tube that the nurses had begged him twice to stop trying to talk. Reaper wheeled her down himself, flanked by two more members, who Lena was beginning to understand functioned as something between bodyguards and family, their faces unreadable, but their attentiveness, absolute, eyes constantly sweeping the hallway for anything that didn't belong. Jack looked smaller in the hospital bed than he had the night before, which Lena understood logically made no sense. He was the same enormous man, the same broad shoulders and thick forearms wrapped now in fresh bandages, but something about the tubes and the pallor of his skin and the visible effort it took him to simply turn his head toward her, made him seem for the first time since she'd met him mortal in a way she hadn't quite let herself believe the night before. His eyes found her and something in his face eased immediately. Some tension he'd clearly been carrying released the moment he confirmed she was actually there, actually safe, actually breathing in front of him. He reached for the whiteboard on his bedside tray, his movements slow and clumsy from exhaustion and medication, and wrote in handwriting far shakier than the night before. Reaper told me what happened. I should have had more men on you from the start. That's on me. Lena shook her head firmly and signed it, waiting for Reaper to translate. This isn't your fault. You were in surgery fighting for your own life. Jack's jaw tightened when he heard the translation, and he wrote back with a fierceness that pushed through even his obvious exhaustion. Doesn't matter, you're under my protection now. That's not a suggestion. That's a fact. Whoever sent that woman needs to understand real quick that it's the last mistake they get to make. Reaper translating added his own aside afterward, his expression grim. He means that literally, by the way, just so you know what you signed up for. Lena felt a strange, complicated warmth mixed with genuine fear settle in her chest. She had grown up her entire life being underestimated, overlooked, treated as fragile by people who assumed her deafness made her helpless in every other way too. Nobody had ever looked at her the way Jack Mason was looking at her right now, broken, bandaged, barely conscious, and somehow radiating a fierce, absolute commitment to her safety that felt less like pity and more like a promise. She signed slowly. "Why, you don't even know me. I did what anyone should have done." Jack's response when Reaper finished translating it hit her harder than she expected. "Nobody else did it, though. You did. In my world, that means something. It means everything. You don't walk away from someone who ran into fire for you. Not ever. Not for any reason." Before Lena could formulate a response, the machines beside Jack's bed let out a soft flurry of beeping. Nothing dramatic this time, nothing like the terrifying spike from the night before, but enough that Reaper glanced at it with immediate concern before relaxing slightly, apparently reading something reassuring in the numbers. "He's exhausted. Needs rest." Reaper wrote it quickly, then added, "We should let him sleep. He hates being told that, so don't expect him to admit it." Jack, even through the haze of exhaustion, managed to shoot Reaper a look that needed no translation whatsoever. And despite everything, despite the fear, the exhaustion, the surreal violence of the morning, Lena felt something almost like a laugh bubble up in her chest at the beer's stubborn irritation on his face. She was wheeled back to her own room as the afternoon slid toward evening, the two guards outside her door rotating out for fresh faces, and it was nearly 6 o'clock when Reaper appeared again, this time with an expression far more guarded than she'd seen from him yet, and a second man trailing behind him that Lena didn't recognize. The second man was younger, maybe late 20s, with sharp, watchful eyes and none of the visible club patches the others wore, instead dressed in plain, unremarkable clothes that somehow made him stand out more among the leather-clad men surrounding her. Reaper wrote quickly, "This is Danny. He does research for us, digs into things. I asked him to look into what happened on the highway. And into Detective Miller." Danny stepped forward and, to Lena's surprise, signed directly to her, slow and imperfect, but clearly self-taught, clearly practiced enough in the last several hours to attempt real communication, rather than relying entirely on Reaper. "I learned a few signs on the drive over. Not much. Sorry." Something about the effort, about a stranger scrambling to learn even a handful of signs just to speak to her directly, hit Lena harder than she expected, and she signed back slower, simpler. "Thank you. That means a lot." Danny nodded, visibly relieved, then pulled out a folder and switched to writing his handwriting. Quick and precise, clearly. A man used to organizing information fast. "I pulled property records, shipping manifests, and financial filings connected to that box truck. It was registered to a shell company. Traced the shell company through 2 more shells before it dead ends at a holding account in Nogales." Lena read the word twice. Nogales. She knew vaguely, the way most Arizona residents did, that the border town carried a certain reputation, a certain weight tied to cartel activity that rarely made it into polite conversation, but that everyone quietly understood. She wrote the cartel. Danny nodded grimly and kept writing. Sinaloa, most likely based on the routing patterns and a few names that came up in the financial trail. They've been trying to push product through Angel territory for almost a year. Jack's turned them down every single time. Word is they finally decided turning him down wasn't an option anymore. Reaper cut in his handwriting, sharper, angrier. "And it gets worse." Danny found something else. Danny hesitated for the first time, glancing at Reaper as though seeking permission before continuing, and Reaper gave a short, grim nod. Danny wrote slower this time, more deliberate. "Detective Miller's bank accounts show 3 deposits in the last 6 months, each one just under $10,000. Structured that way on purpose to stay under the reporting threshold. Traced back through 2 accounts, and one of them connects to the same holding company that owns the truck." Lena stared at the words until her vision blurred slightly, a cold, sick certainty settling into her stomach. The detective who had dismissed her account of the crash, who had written her off as confused and traumatized, who had walked out of Jack's hospital room with such practiced, dismissive ease, he wasn't simply incompetent or overworked. He was being paid to make sure the truth never surfaced, paid quite possibly to make sure the only living witness who could contradict the official story didn't stay alive long enough to testify. She wrote, her hand trembling. "The nurse this morning, was that Miller too? Did he send her?" Reaper and Danny exchanged a look, and it was Reaper who finally answered, his handwriting heavier than before. "We don't know for certain yet, But it's not a coincidence that the one detective assigned to bury this case is also the one detective who knew exactly which hospital room you were in. The implications sat in the room like a physical weight. If Miller had access to her location, her medical records, her exact room number. If Miller had been the one who'd made it possible for a fake nurse with a fatal syringe to walk unquestioned into a secured hospital floor, then the danger wasn't some distant cartel force operating from the shadows. It was standing inside the very institutions that were supposed to protect her, wearing a badge that should have meant safety. Lena signed her hands, moving fast, fear and fury tangled together. What do we do? Reaper's answer came without hesitation, his handwriting firm and absolute. We move you somewhere safer. Tonight. And we make sure whoever's giving Miller his orders understands there's a wall around you now that they can't buy their way through. The discharge process that followed happened faster than Lena had thought medically possible. Hospital administration apparently eager to remove both the security risk and the potential liability from their premises. And within 2 hours, Lena found herself being wheeled through a rear service entrance, flanked by 4 members of the club toward a caravan of vehicles that had assembled in the loading dock with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. She was helped into the back seat of a black SUV, its windows tinted dark enough that no one outside could see in, and Reaper climbed in beside her while Danny took the front passenger seat, already back on his laptop, fingers moving fast across the keyboard. As the convoy pulled out, Lena counted 6 vehicles. Total motorcycles included, riding in a formation that felt less like an escort and more like a moving fortress. She watched the hospital shrink in the side mirror and felt the strange, dizzying reality of her life crash fully into focus for the first time since the accident. 24 hours ago, she had been an ordinary young woman driving to a physical therapy appointment, worried about nothing larger than her degenerative condition and the impossible math of a surgery she couldn't afford. Now she was riding in an armored convoy, fleeing a corrupt derivative and a cartel that had already tried once to kill her, surrounded by men whose loyalty to her was as fierce as it was in its own strange way, terrifying. Reaper noticed her staring out the window and tapped her shoulder gently to get her attention, then wrote on a small notepad balanced against his knee. "You doing okay?" Lena considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "No, but I'm alive. I'll take it." Reaper's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but carried real warmth nonetheless, and he wrote back, "That's the right attitude around here. Alive today, worry about tomorrow when it comes." The convoy drove for nearly 2 hours, winding away from the highway and up into terrain that grew increasingly rugged, mountains rising dark against the evening sky, the paved road eventually giving way to a well-maintained but clearly private gravel path that wound through dense scrub brush toward a cluster of buildings Lena hadn't expected. It wasn't a clubhouse in the way she'd vaguely imagined, no roadside bar with motorcycles parked outside. This was something far more substantial, a compound really set back into the mountainside with clear sight lines in every direction. Several buildings connected by covered walkways, and a perimeter fence that Lena noticed, even in the dim light, was considerably more sophisticated than simple ranch fencing. Danny, catching her studying it, turned in his seat and wrote quickly, "Jack bought this place 15 years ago. Started as just land, built it up slow. Most people don't even know it exists." The SUV pulled to a stop in front of the largest building, and as Lena stepped out stiff and sore from the drive, she was struck by how many people were already there waiting. Men and women, both a mixture of ages, all wearing the same leather vests she'd become familiar with over the last day. Their expressions ranging from curious to openly protective as they watched her emerge from the vehicle. An older woman stepped forward first. Gray hair pulled back in a practical braid, her face lined with a particular toughness that came from a lifetime spent outdoors, and she offered Lena a small, warm smile before holding up a piece of paper already prepared, clearly anticipating the communication barrier. "My name's Ruth. I'm Jack's sister. We've got a room ready for you. Food too if you're hungry. You're safe here, I promise you that." Something about the simple directness of the promise delivered by a stranger who had every reason to be suspicious of an outsider, suddenly thrust into the middle of their world, settled a small piece of the chaos in Lena's chest, and she found herself nodding, grateful tears pricking unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. Ruth led her inside through hallways lined with photographs Lena didn't have time to properly examine, into a small but comfortable room with a real bed, clean linens, and to Lena's quiet surprise, a bedside lamp rigged with what looked like a modified, vibrating alarm system the kind designed specifically for deaf users tucked beside a standard alarm clock. Ruth noticed her noticing it and wrote quickly, "Jack had one of the boys install that a few hours ago. Said you'd need to feel an alert, not just hear one. Man doesn't do anything halfway, even flat on his back in a hospital bed." Lena stared at the small device for a long moment, something in her chest tightening with an emotion she didn't have an easy name for. In 22 years of navigating a hearing world that so rarely bothered to accommodate her, she had never once had someone anticipate a need like this, without being asked, without being reminded, without her having to advocate exhausted and alone for the most basic considerations. She wrote, her hand trembling slightly, "Thank you. This means more than you know." Ruth's expression softened further, and she reached out briefly to squeeze Lena's shoulder before stepping back toward the door. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. We've got a lot to figure out." Lena didn't sleep well that first night, despite the exhaustion pressing down on every muscle in her body. She kept waking to check the small device on her nightstand, half convinced that danger would find her even here, deep in the mountains, surrounded by armed men who had promised her safety with such fierce conviction. Every creak of the building settling, every shift of shadow across the wall, sent her heart racing before her rational mind caught up and reminded her again and again that she was surrounded by people determined to keep her breathing. By morning, she found Reaper and Danny already awake in the main building's kitchen, hunched over Danny's laptop with matching expressions of grim concentration, and when they noticed her in the doorway, Reaper waved her over with an urgency that immediately set her nerves back on edge. Danny turned the laptop toward her, and Lena's stomach dropped as she read the headline on the screen, a local news article published just hours earlier, with a photograph of the wreckage from the highway crash, beneath a headline that made her jaw clench with fury. Motorcycle gang violence claims 3 lives in Highway 87. Crash. Investigation ongoing. Lena read the article twice, her hands curling into fists, as she absorbed the careful, deliberate framing. No mention of the box truck's intentional trajectory, no mention of witnesses, no mention of anything except vague implications that internal club conflict or rival gang violence had somehow caused a truck to spontaneously combust in the middle of 6 motorcycles. She grabbed the notepad Danny had left nearby and wrote furiously, "This is a lie. This isn't what happened at all." Reaper's expression was grim but unsurprised. "Miller's fingerprints are all over this narrative. He's building the official story before anyone else can. Making sure if you do come forward, it looks like you're contradicting established facts instead of the other way around." Danny added his own expression tight with barely contained anger. "There's worse. Scroll down." Lena's eyes moved to the bottom of the article where a small quote had been attributed to an unnamed witness at the scene, describing chaotic, contradictory details that bore only passing resemblance to what Lena had actually seen, details that, if believed, would make any future account she gave sound confused and unreliable by comparison. She wrote, her hand shaking now with genuine rage rather than fear. "They were building a case against my own memory before I've even said anything publicly." Reaper nodded grimly. "That's exactly it. And it means we're running out of time to get the truth out before their version becomes the only version anyone remembers." The kitchen door swung open before Lena could respond, and Ruth entered, moving with visible urgency, her expression tight in a way that immediately silenced the room. She held up her phone, already displaying something, and turned it toward Reaper first before showing Lena, and Lena's heart clenched as she read the message on the screen, a text apparently forwarded from one of Jack's contacts, still working inside the hospital, warning that hospital security had just flagged a second suspicious individual attempting to access patient records under a false pretext. This one claiming to be a family member, requesting Jack Mason's room number and discharge information. Reaper's jaw tightened to the point of visible strain, and he wrote fast, his handwriting jagged with barely controlled anger. "They're still looking for both of you. Good thing we moved when we did." Lena felt the walls of the room seem to close in slightly, the reality of her situation crashing over her in a fresh wave. It wasn't over. It had barely even begun. Somewhere out there, people with resources and patience and no apparent limit on how far they were willing to go were actively hunting both her and Jack, and the only thing standing between them and success was a fortified compound in the mountains and the fierce loyalty of people she'd known for barely a day. She signed, forcing her hands steady through sheer will. "How is Jack? Can he be moved here too once he's stable enough?" Reaper's expression shifted, something more careful entering his eyes before he answered, and the careful pause set Lena's nerves screaming even before he finished writing. That's actually why Ruth came in. Hospital called 20 minutes ago. Someone tried to alter Jack's medication chart overnight. Nurse caught it during a routine check, thank God, before anything was administered. But it means somebody inside that hospital, on the inside staff or otherwise, is actively trying to finish what that fake nurse started with you. The room seemed to tilt slightly around Lena, a cold, sick fear spreading through her chest at the realization that Jack, bedridden, weakened, tethered to machines, and utterly unable to defend himself the way he had on that burning highway, was every bit as vulnerable right now as she had been, perhaps more so. She wrote her hand, pressing so hard into the paper it nearly tore. We have to get him out of there. Now, before they try again. Reaper was already nodding before she finished writing, already moving toward the door, already pulling out his phone to make calls Lena couldn't hear, but could read clearly in the tension of his shoulders and the sharp, decisive movements of his hands. Within the hour, a new convoy was assembling, this one larger than the last, nearly a dozen vehicles and twice as many motorcycles. Every member of the club that could be mobilized on such short notice, gathering in the compound's main yard, with an intensity that reminded Lena uncomfortably of soldiers preparing for battle, rather than bikers preparing for a hospital transfer. Ruth found Lena as she watched the preparations and wrote quickly on a fresh notepad. You're staying here. It's too dangerous for you to go back to that hospital. Lena shook her head immediately firmly and grabbed the pad back. No, Jack got hurt shielding me. I'm not staying safe in the mountains while everyone else risks their lives to protect him. I'm coming. Ruth studied her for a long moment. Something complicated moving across her weathered face. Concern, certainly, but also gradually a kind of reluctant respect that mirrored what Lena had already seen in Reaper's eyes the night before. She wrote finally, You're a stubborn one. Jack's going to like that about you. The drive back down the mountain felt different from the drive up, had faster, tenser, every member of the convoy visibly on high alert. Reaper, in the seat beside Lena, constantly scanning the road both ahead and behind them, one hand never straying far from something holstered beneath his jacket. They arrived at the hospital's rear entrance to find chaos already unfolding, more security than Lena had seen the day before, hospital staff moving with visible tension, and at the center of it all, a scene that made Lena's blood run cold the moment she saw it through the SUV's tinted window. Two men in dark suits, clearly not hospital staff, clearly not law enforcement, despite an attempt at official bearing, were arguing heatedly with hospital security near the main entrance, gesturing toward a clipboard toward the building, their body language radiating an aggressive impatience that set every alarm bell in Lena's mind screaming. Reaper followed her gaze and went rigid beside her, his hand tightening on the door handle, even as he grabbed his phone and typed something rapid to the rest of the convoy. Danny in the front seat turned back with his own phone raised, having apparently zoomed in with the camera, and showed Lena the screen with a grim confirming nod. Same holding company. I recognized one of those men from a financial filing I pulled last night. That's cartel muscle, not lawyers. Before Lena could fully process the implication, the SUV's radio, which she couldn't hear, but could see Reaper responding to with rapid, tense gestures, apparently carried new information, because his expression shifted from tense to genuinely alarmed, and he turned to her with hands moving fast, deliberate, making sure she caught every word, even without Danny's translation help. They're not here for records. They're stalling security at the front so somebody else can get to Jack's room from a different entrance. Lena's heart slammed against her bruised ribs, pain and fear tangling together into something sharp and electric. She looked toward the hospital, toward the building where Jack lay defenseless, behind a door that suddenly felt paper-thin against the forces converging on it from every direction, and she understood with a clarity that cut through every ounce of exhaustion and pain she was carrying, that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether the man who had shielded her body with his own in the middle of an explosion would live to see another sunrise. Reaper was already moving, throwing the SUV door open, shouting orders. Lena couldn't hear to the men pouring out of the other vehicles around them, and Lena, without waiting for permission, without waiting to be told to stay safely behind, threw her own door open and followed. Whatever was about to happen inside that hospital, she was not going to watch it unfold from a distance. Not after everything. Not when the man fighting for his life in that building had already proven in the worst possible circumstances exactly how far he was willing to go for someone who mattered to him. She just prayed they weren't already too late. Lena's feet hit the pavement running before her mind had fully caught up with her body. Reaper's hand closing around her arm, not to stop her, but to angle her toward a side entrance, instead of the chaos still unfolding at the front doors, where the two suited men were still locked in their manufactured argument with hospital security. Danny peeled off toward the parking structure, phone still raised, still tracking movement. Lena couldn't see, and three more club members fell into step around her and Reaper, forming a loose but deliberate wall of bodies as they pushed through a service entrance that Reaper seemed to know led directly toward the elevator bank closest to Jack's floor. Inside the hospital's ordinary rhythm, nurses moving between rooms, a cart of lunch trays being wheeled down the hall, the mundane hum of a Tuesday afternoon struck Lena as almost obscene, given what she now understood was converging on this building from multiple directions at once. Nobody here knew. Nobody here had any idea that armed men were maneuvering through their hallways with intent to kill. And Lena felt a fresh wave of fear, not just for Jack now, but for every innocent person who might get caught in whatever was about to happen. Reaper's hand found her shoulder, firm grounding, and he turned her to face him long enough to sign something clumsy but urgent. "Stay behind me, always." Lena nodded, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and they pushed into the stairwell, instead of waiting for the elevator, taking the stairs two at a time, despite her bruised ribs screaming in protest with every impact. They emerged onto Jack's floor to a scene that made Lena's blood turn to ice. The two club members who had been stationed outside Jack's door, the same men who'd guarded her own room the night before, were gone. Not dead, she registered with a flood of relief a half-second later, but pinned against the wall by hospital security guards who had clearly been summoned by someone. Their hands raised, their expressions furious and helpless in equal measure, as a uniformed guard shouted something at them that Lena couldn't hear but could read in the guard's rigid, accusing posture. It took Lena only a moment to understand what had happened. Someone had called in a false report. Weapons probably, or a fabricated disturbance, something that would guarantee the hospital's own security, pulled Jack's actual protectors away from his door at exactly the moment it mattered most. Reaper saw it too, and his face went through a transformation so fast and so total that Lena barely recognized him for a second, the careful, controlled man from the last 2 days replaced by something harder, something that radiated pure lethal focus. He didn't stop to argue with security. He didn't stop at all. He shoved past the confrontation, entirely moving down the hallway toward Jack's room with a speed that had Lena struggling to keep pace, her lungs burning, her ribs screaming. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't not, with the image burned into her mind of Jack lying helpless and unguarded just beyond that door. They reached the room half a second too late to stop what was already happening, and a half second too early to be too late completely. A man in hospital scrubs, another fake Lena, understood instantly, the ID badge dangling from his collar. Too crisp, too new. Had his hand on the IV line feeding into Jack's arm, a syringe already uncapped in his other hand, and Jack, weakened, but not unconscious, had somehow gotten one hand locked around the man's wrist, holding him back through sheer stubborn will, even as the effort visibly cost him everything he had left. Reaper crossed the room in what felt like a single motion, and Lena watched frozen in the doorway as he drove his shoulder into the fake orderly with a force that sent the man crashing into the monitoring equipment beside Jack's bed, machines toppling, alarms she couldn't hear, but could see flashing red and urgent across every screen in the room. The syringe went flying, skittering across the floor, and Lena, without thinking, without weighing the danger, lunged forward and stomped her heel down on it, hard enough to shatter the glass barrel before it could be recovered. The fake orderly scrambled backward, reaching beneath his scrubs for something Lena didn't need a translator to recognize as a weapon, and Reaper was faster, slamming a fist into the man's jaw with brutal, practiced efficiency before he could clear the holster, following it with a second blow that put the man down hard against the floor and kept him there. Real nurses flooded the room seconds later, drawn by the crashing equipment and the flashing alarms, and chaos erupted in earnest hospital staff shouting security, finally arriving in force, Jack straining weakly against his own exhaustion to sit up, his eyes finding Lena across the room with an intensity that cut through everything else happening around them. His mouth moved, and this time Lena didn't need Reaper to translate because the shape of the words was unmistakable, raw, and immediate. "You're okay." Lena nodded, fast tears she hadn't realized were falling, suddenly blurring her vision, and she crossed the room to his bedside, despite every protest from the nurses now trying to restore order, gripping his hand, the same hand that had held off a killer through sheer stubborn will, and holding on like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had gone completely unmoored. Security dragged the fake orderly out still unconscious, and within minutes, hospital administrators arrived, their faces pale with the dawning realization of exactly how badly their security had been compromised, twice now in less than 48 hours, twice, with intent to kill two separate patients under their care. A woman in a sharp gray suit, clearly someone senior in the hospital's administration, arrived, flanked by two more security personnel, and immediately began writing on a tablet she carried, turning it toward Lena and Jack, both once she'd assessed the scene. "I am so sorry. This should never have happened. We are moving both of you to a secured wing immediately with round-the-clock guard presence. This is now a police matter." Reaper's expression when he read that last line hardened immediately, and he grabbed the tablet from her hands with more force than was strictly polite, typing rapidly before shoving it back toward her. "Not Detective Miller. He is compromised. If he comes near this room again, you will have a much bigger problem than a security breach." The administrator's eyes widened slightly, clearly unprepared for that particular accusation. But something in Reaper's absolute certainty, combined with the two attempted murders that had just occurred on her watch, seemed to convince her not to argue. She nodded slowly and wrote back, "I'll have a different detective assigned. I'll make the call myself." It was nearly an hour later, after Jack had been moved to a new room on a floor with restricted elevator access and a security presence that finally matched the danger surrounding him, after the fake orderly had been taken into custody by actual uncompromised police officers who arrived from a neighboring jurisdiction rather than the local department Miller worked for, that Lena finally allowed herself to sit down, her body trembling with the delayed aftershock of everything that had just happened. Jack, propped up in his new bed, watched her with an expression that held none of the fierce command she'd seen from him before, something softer now, something that looked almost like guilt. He reached for the whiteboard, his hand steadier now than it had been the day before, and wrote slowly, deliberately, "You shouldn't have come. You could have been killed just now." Lena looked up at him, and something in her chest, some reservoir of exhaustion and fear and stubborn refusal that had been building since the moment she'd first run toward that burning truck, finally broke loose. She grabbed the pad from him and wrote back, her hand pressing hard enough to nearly tear the paper. "You didn't leave me on that highway. I'm not leaving you here. Leaving you." Jack read the words, and something moved across his weathered face that Lena hadn't seen from him yet. Not gratitude exactly, not quite the fierce protectiveness he'd shown before, but something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition. Like he was seeing something in her that matched something in himself, some shared understanding of what it meant to run toward danger instead of away from it. He wrote simply, "Stubborn woman." Lena, despite everything, felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward, and she signed back, letting Reaper translate this time, since her hands were still trembling. Too much for precision. Takes one to know one. The moment of lightness didn't last long. Danny appeared in the doorway less than a minute later, his laptop tucked under one arm, his expression grim enough that every scrap of humor evaporated from the room instantly. He held up the screen for Reaper first, then turned it toward Lena and Jack both, and Lena's stomach dropped as she read the breaking news alert displayed across it. "Breaking local detective under investigation. Following hospital security breach. Sources cite possible corruption ties." Reaper read it fast, his eyebrows rising, and he looked to Danny for explanation. Danny wrote quickly beneath it, "I leaked the financial records this morning, anonymously, to 3 different outlets. Figured if we couldn't stop Miller through official channels fast enough, we could at least make it too public for anyone to quietly bury." Jack, reading the translation, gave a short approving nod, despite his exhaustion, but Reaper's expression remained tense. "That's going to accelerate things. Whoever's paying Miller isn't going to sit back and let their whole operation get exposed without a fight. This might make things more dangerous before it makes them safer." As if summoned by the words themselves, Lena's phone recovered from her belongings and returned to her that morning, buzzed against the small table beside her chair, and she picked it up to find a text notification from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it, and the message on the screen made her blood run cold. "We know where you are. This isn't over. You should have minded your own business." Lena's hands shook as she turned the phone toward Reaper, who read the message and immediately snatched it from her, his face going through the same rapid transformation into cold fury she'd seen when he'd found the fake orderly at Jack's bedside. He typed something fast on his own phone, then held the screen up for Danny, who nodded grimly, and immediately began working fingers flying across his keyboard with an urgency that told Lena he was trying to trace the message's origin. Jack, watching this unfold from his bed, grabbed the whiteboard again, his handwriting heavier now, angrier. They're getting desperate. Good. Desperate people make mistakes. Lena signed her hand, still trembling. How can you be calm about this? They just threatened to kill me directly. Reaper translated, and Jack's response when it came carried a weight that silenced every other thought in Lena's head. I've spent 30 years building something these people think they can just walk over because we ride motorcycles instead of wearing suits. They're wrong, and they're about to find out exactly how wrong, because nobody threatens someone under my protection and walks away like nothing happened. Danny looked up from his laptop, suddenly his expression sharpening. Got something. The number that texted Lena bounced through 2 proxy servers, but the third one's sloppy. It traces back to a burner phone purchased at a gas station 40 minutes from here. And get this, the purchase was made using a card registered to a shell company. Same shell company that owns the truck. The room went very still for a moment, everyone absorbing the implication, and it was Jack who finally broke the silence, his written words carrying a grim, focused determination that Lena found herself instinctively trusting, even amid the chaos. Then we know they're close, and if they're close, they're findable. Reaper's expression shifted into something sharper, more calculating, and he wrote quickly, I'll get more brothers positioned around the hospital perimeter tonight. And I want eyes on that gas station. See if we can pull camera footage before local police even think to ask for it. Jack nodded his approval, then his gaze shifted back to Lena, softening slightly even through the hard focus of the moment. You should rest. You've been running on nothing but adrenaline for 2 days straight. Lena shook her head immediately, signing with a fierceness that surprised even her. I'm not going anywhere. Not while there's still a threat against both of us. Jack studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes before he finally nodded a small, reluctant concession. Fine. But you rest here in this room where I can see you're safe. Deal. Lena hesitated, then nodded, some of the tension in her shoulders finally easing at the compromise, and she settled into the chair beside his bed, her body finally allowing itself to acknowledge just how bone-deep her exhaustion had become. She must have drifted, despite everything, because the next thing she registered clearly was Reaper's hand on her shoulder, gentle but urgent, shaking her awake, and the tension radiating from his entire body told her immediately that something new had happened. She blinked hard, disoriented, and grabbed for the notepad automatically, her hands still clumsy with sleep. Reaper was already writing, his handwriting fast and jagged. Miller just showed up downstairs, demanding access to Jack's room. Says he's still the lead detective on the case and has every legal right to be here. Lena's heart slammed against her ribs, fear and fury tangling together instantly. She looked toward Jack, who was awake, alert, despite the late hour, his jaw set in a hard line that told Lena he'd already been informed and had already formed an opinion about it. He grabbed the whiteboard. Don't let him up here. Not without someone from the new department present. He is not getting near either of us alone again. Reaper nodded and moved toward the door. But before he could reach it, it swung open and Detective Miller himself stepped through, his expression carrying none of the professional neutrality Lena remembered from their first encounter. This time his face was flushed, his movements sharp and agitated, a man clearly cornered and unraveling under the pressure of public exposure. He didn't bother with the notepad this time. He spoke directly at Jack, fast and clipped, and it was Reaper who stepped forward to translate for Lena's benefit, his own expression tight with barely restrained hostility. He's saying this is a witch hunt, that someone's trying to frame him, that he's still the lead on this case, whether people like it or not. Jack's response came in the form of him simply holding up the whiteboard he'd already prepared, apparently anticipating exactly this confrontation, and the words on it were blunt enough that even without translation, Miller's face went pale as he read them. Your bank accounts don't lie, Detective. 3 deposits. Same shell company that owns the truck that tried to kill 6 of my men, and the same shell company connected to 2 separate attempts on this woman's life. Explain that to the new detectives, not to me. Miller's composure cracked visibly, his hands curling into fists at his sides, and whatever he said next came out fast and low and furious, close enough to Jack's bed that one of the newly assigned security guards standing at the door stepped forward, instinctively hand resting near his own holster. Reaper's translation came clipped urgent. He's saying we have no idea what we're dealing with, that this goes higher than anyone realizes. That backing off now would be the smartest thing any of us ever did. Lena felt ice slide down her spine at the implication buried in those words. Not a denial, not an alibi, but something closer to a warning, an admission wrapped inside a threat. Jack weakened as he was pushed himself up further against his pillows, his eyes locking onto Miller's with an intensity that needed no translation whatsoever. And whatever he said in response, low and rough from his damaged throat, made Miller take an actual physical step backward. Reaper, watching this exchange, allowed himself a small, grim smile before translating or busting it for Lena. He just told Miller that whoever's giving him orders should come say that to his face themselves, because Jack's not afraid of shadows, and everyone in this room just watched a corrupt cop flinch. Security finally moved to escort Miller from the room, his protest growing louder and more desperate as they guided him firmly toward the door. And just before he disappeared from view, entirely his eyes found Lena's across the room, and something in his expression, not anger now, but something closer to genuine fear, sent a fresh chill through her entire body. He mouthed something at her, deliberate, clearly wanting her to understand even without sound. You have no idea how deep this goes. Then he was gone, and the room fell into a heavy, uncertain silence that none of them seemed eager to break first. It was Danny who finally spoke, still hunched over his laptop in the corner. His expression troubled in a way that told Lena he'd caught something in the exchange that the rest of them might have missed. He turned the laptop around, showing a document he'd apparently been working on throughout the confrontation. I've been digging deeper into that shell company while all this was happening. Found something that changes things. Reaper crossed to look, and his face tightened as he read whatever Danny was pointing to on the screen. Danny wrote quickly beneath it for Lena's benefit. The shell company that owns the truck isn't just tied to cartel shipping routes. It's also connected through two more layers of ownership to a private security firm. One that holds several government contracts, including, and this is the part that worries me, a contract with the very police department Miller works for. The implications settled over the room like a physical weight, and Jack, reading the translation, Reaper quickly scrawled out, went very still, his expression darkening into something Lena hadn't seen from him yet. Not fury exactly, but something colder, more calculating. He wrote slowly, deliberately, this isn't just cartel money buying off one dirty cop. This is bigger. Somebody with real institutional power is protecting this operation from multiple directions at once. Lena felt the floor of her understanding shift beneath her entirely. What had started as a single horrific highway crash had somehow expanded in the space of 2 days into something with tentacles reaching into local law enforcement, into private security, contracts, into layers of corporate ownership, designed specifically to obscure exactly who was pulling the strings and why. She signed, her hands moving with a fierce, frightened determination. If this goes as high as you're suggesting, how do we even fight it? Reaper translated. And Jack's response when it came carried a weight and certainty that steadied something in Lena's chest, despite the enormity of what they were facing. The same way we've always fought things bigger than us. Together, loud enough that they can't hide anymore. And smart enough that they can't touch us before the truth gets out. Danny, still working at his laptop, suddenly straightened his expression, shifting into something sharper, more urgent. Guys, I think I just found our way to make this loud. He turned the screen toward all of them, and Lena leaned forward to read what he'd pulled up, an email thread apparently intercepted or leaked from somewhere within the private security firm's own network, discussing in chillingly clinical terms the logistics of neutralizing loose ends connected to a shipment that had been compromised on Highway 87. Lena's stomach turned as she read the phrase again. Loose ends. That was what she was to these people. Not a person who had run into fire to save a stranger's life. Not a young woman fighting for her own survival against forces that had already tried twice to kill her, but a logistical problem to be solved, a liability to be eliminated with the same cold efficiency as a damaged shipment. Reaper, reading over her shoulder, went rigid with fury, and he grabbed the whiteboard from Jack's tray to write his own urgent addition. This is enough. This is actual proof. We take this straight to the FBI, not local police. Nobody local can be trusted with something this deep. Jack nodded slowly, his expression grim but resolute, and he wrote back, agreed. But we need to move fast. The second they realize this thread's been compromised, they'll scramble to cover their tracks completely, and any evidence trail we've got could vanish in hours. Danny was already forwarding the evidence to a secure email account, his fingers moving with practiced urgency, and he spoke aloud even as he typed, and Reaper translated in real time for Lena's benefit. "I've got a contact from a case a few years back. Legitimate FBI agent not connected to any of the compromised local departments. I'm sending this directly to her encrypted with everything we've pulled so far." The room fell into a tense, focused quiet as Danny worked the only movement coming from Jack's monitors, quietly tracking his vitals, and the occasional soft rustle of Reaper shifting his weight near the door, eyes still scanning the hallway beyond it with unbroken vigilance. It was nearly midnight when Danny finally looked up from his laptop, and something in his expression had shifted from tense focus into cautious relief. "She got it. Confirmed receipt. Said given what we've sent, she's opening a federal investigation first thing tomorrow, and she's requesting protective custody arrangements for both of you as material witnesses." Lena felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in hours, a fragile thread of hope threading through the exhaustion and fear that had defined nearly every moment since the crash. Jack, reading the news, allowed himself a small, tired smile, and he wrote on the whiteboard with visibly renewed energy despite everything his body had endured. "Maybe we're finally getting somewhere." But the fragile relief in the room shattered barely 20 minutes later, when the lights in Jack's room flickered once, then died completely, plunging the entire floor into sudden disorienting darkness. Lena's chest seized with pure animal panic, her eyes straining uselessly against the blackness, her ears offering nothing at all to help her understand what was happening around her. And she felt Reaper's hand close around her arm, immediately pulling her down and back, positioning his own body between her and the door, with an instinct honed by years of exactly this kind of danger. Emergency lighting flickered on seconds later, dim and red, casting everything in a stark, urgent glow. And through the small window in the door, Lena could see shapes moving in the hallway outside, too many shapes moving too fast, with a coordination that told her instantly this was not simply a random power failure. Jack, despite his injuries, was already struggling to sit up further, his hand reaching toward the small drawer beside his bed, where Lena realized with a fresh jolt of fear, someone had apparently placed a weapon for exactly this contingency. Reaper's phone buzzed once, and he glanced at it fast before his face hardened into something Lena had only seen once before in the moment he'd driven his shoulder into the fake orderly, threatening Jack's life. He turned to Lena and signed fast and blunt, "No time now for careful translation through Danny or the notepad. Attack. Now, stay down." The door burst open. It wasn't the attackers who came through first. It was one of Jack's own men shoving the door wide with his shoulder, his mouth already moving in a shout. Lena couldn't hear his weapon drawn and pointed back down the hallway behind him rather than into the room. Reaper's grip on Lena's arm eased a fraction, though he didn't let go entirely, and she watched his face read the situation faster than she could process it herself. Recognition then, a sharp nod, then his own hand moving to the weapon at his hip as he pushed her firmly behind the reinforced frame of the hospital bed. The man in the doorway signed something fast and rough, clearly not fluent, but urgent enough to communicate regardless. And Reaper answered him with a short, hard gesture before turning back to write on the whiteboard, with hands that were for the first time since Lena had met him, visibly unsteady. 3 men breached the stairwell on the east side. "Security's down. Our guys are engaging. Do not leave this room." Lena's whole body was shaking. Now adrenaline and fear tangled together so completely she could barely tell where one ended and the other began. And beside her, Jack had managed to pull himself fully upright, despite the IV line still tethering him to the bed, his weapon drawn, his eyes fixed on the door with a focus that seemed to burn straight through his exhaustion. He caught Lena's eye and jerked his chin toward the far corner of the room, away from the door, away from the window, and mouthed a single word she didn't need to hear to understand. "Down." She dropped low, pressing her back against the wall in the corner he'd indicated, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her teeth, and she watched because she couldn't look away, because some stubborn part of her refused to close her eyes even now, as Reaper positioned himself at the doorframe, weapon raised, body angled to protect as much of the room as possible. The emergency lighting flickered again, red and stuttering, throwing everything into a nightmarish, disjointed strobe that made every shape in the hallway beyond the door seem to jump and distort. Lena caught glimpses through the small window, a man in dark tactical gear moving fast, another club member colliding with him, both crashing out of view but without sound, without the screaming and gunfire that she knew logically must be filling that hallway right now. The violence took on a strange, silent horror, all its own like, watching a nightmare through thick glass. Jack's hand found hers, suddenly gripping hard, despite his own weakened state. And when she looked at him, his eyes held hers with a fierce, steadying intensity that cut through some of her panic. He mouthed slowly, deliberately, making sure she could read every syllable. "You are safe." She didn't believe it, not entirely. Not with chaos exploding just beyond that door, but something about his absolute certainty about the way he said it, like a fact rather than a hope, gave her enough of an anchor to keep breathing steadily instead of spiraling further into panic. The door frame exploded with a spray of splinters as something struck it hard, and Reaper staggered back a step before recovering, firing twice down the hallway. In quick succession, his face a mask of cold-focused violence that bore no resemblance to the careful patient man who had taught himself to sign just to make her more comfortable. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shapes in the hallway shifted, more of Jack's men flooding in from the far end, overwhelming whatever force had managed to breach the floor. And within what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, the chaos began to still. Reaper lowered his weapon slowly, his chest heaving, and he turned to check the room behind him, his eyes finding Lena first, then Jack, cataloging them both for injury, with the swift, practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before and hoped never to have to again. He crossed to the whiteboard, his hands still not quite steady, and wrote, "Threat neutralized. 2 attackers down, 1 in custody. We lost nobody. Everybody breathe." Lena felt her body sag against the wall, the adrenaline draining out of her all at once and leaving something hollow and shaking in its place. And it was only then, in the sudden, quiet aftermath, that she registered the wetness on her own cheeks. Tears she hadn't been aware of crying until the danger had passed enough to let her feel anything at all beyond survival. Jack's hand was still holding hers, and he squeezed once firm and grounding before releasing it to grab the whiteboard back from Reaper, his own writing shakier than before, but no less determined. "They're not stopping. Whoever's behind this just tried a direct assault on a guarded hospital floor. That's not desperation anymore. That's a declaration." Danny, who Lena realized had been pressed flat against the floor beside his laptop through the entire assault, finally pushed himself upright, his face pale, but his hands already moving back toward his keyboard with a kind of shell-shocked determination. He wrote quickly, his usual careful precision replaced by something more urgent, more ragged. "I got a partial ID on the man in custody while it was happening. Facial rec through a database I probably shouldn't have access to. Name's Esteban Ruiz. Prior arrest for trafficking weapons charges. 1 assault case that got dropped under circumstances that smell exactly like what's been happening to us. He's cartel enforcement. Not local, not freelance. This confirms it's a coordinated operation, not just Miller acting alone." Reaper read this over Danny's shoulder and nodded grimly before adding his own note beneath it, "Which means the FBI contact needs this information immediately. If they move on Ruiz before word gets back to whoever's running this, we might actually get ahead of them for once." Danny was already forwarding the information, his fingers flying, and within minutes, new lights filled the hallway outside real law enforcement. This time, federal agents Lena could tell apart from local police by the particular calm, methodical way they moved through the wreckage of the assault, cataloging evidence, questioning Jack's men with a professionalism that felt entirely different from the corrupt dismissiveness Miller had shown her that first day. A woman in a dark jacket stepped into the doorway, eventually flashing credentials that even Lena, without hearing a single word of introduction, could recognize as substantially more legitimate than anything Miller had shown her. She approached with a notepad already in hand, clearly briefed in advance about Lena's deafness, and wrote directly and clearly, "Miss Carter, I'm Special Agent Patricia Reyes. I received the materials your associate sent last night. I want you to know we're taking this extremely seriously, and as of an hour ago, this investigation is officially federal. Detective Miller has been placed on administrative leave pending full review." Lena read the words twice, something in her chest, finally cautiously unclenching for the first time in what felt like days. She wrote back, her hand still trembling slightly, "Is it over? Are we safe now?" Agent Reyes' expression, when she looked up from reading the question, carried an honesty Lena appreciated, even as it settled cold in her stomach. "Not yet. Whoever's funding this operation is still out there, and they clearly have resources and reach we're still mapping. But you're not fighting this alone anymore. That's the difference tonight makes." Over the following hours, federal agents secured the floor and began the meticulous process of processing the scene. Agent Reyes gathered Lena, Jack Reaper, and Danny together in a temporarily cleared conference room down the hall, the whiteboard and notepads becoming the primary tools of communication as she laid out in careful, methodical detail exactly what the investigation had uncovered so far. The shell company that owned the truck, she explained, tracing its ownership through a diagram she sketched by hand for Lena's benefit, connected not just to cartel shipping routes, but to a network of legitimate-seeming businesses that had been laundering both money and influence through southern Arizona for the better part of 3 years. The private security firm Danny had identified held contracts not just with the local police department, but with 2 other agencies in neighboring counties, giving whoever controlled it an unsettling degree of institutional reach. Jack, listening to the translation Reaper provided, absorbed each revelation with a grim, controlled fury that radiated off him even through his obvious exhaustion. And when Agent Reyes finished her summary, he grabbed the whiteboard and wrote with a heaviness that made Lena's chest ache in sympathy. "How many of my men were hurt tonight because of this?" Agent Reyes' expression softened slightly at the question, and she answered honestly. "2 with minor injuries. Nothing life-threatening. You got lucky." Jack's jaw tightened, and he wrote back, his handwriting pressing hard enough to nearly tear through the paper. "Luck's not something I plan to rely on twice." Agent Reyes nodded, apparently understanding the sentiment completely, and turned back to her notes. "Here's where we stand. We have enough now to move forward with arrest warrants for several individuals connected to the shell company, including 2 executives who've been quietly overseeing shipments through this corridor for months. But the man at the very top, whoever's actually directing this operation, remains unidentified. Every trail we follow dead ends into another layer of obscured ownership." Lena signed, and Reaper translated for the room. "What happens to me? Do I have to testify? Will that put me in more danger?" Agent Reyes' answer, when it came, carried the same careful honesty she'd offered before. "Realistically, yes, your testimony will be crucial, especially regarding what you witnessed on the highway. But we can arrange protective custody through the trial process, and given everything you have already survived, I think you understand better than most what kind of risk that carries. I won't lie to you about that." Jack's hand found the whiteboard again before Lena could fully process her own fear at the answer, and he wrote with an absolute, unshakable certainty that steadied something in her chest even amid the mounting dread. "Protective custody or not, she's not facing any of this without us. That's not negotiable. Whatever the federal government's offering, my people are staying close." Agent Reyes studied him for a long moment, something that looked almost like reluctant respect crossing her professional expression before she nodded slowly. "I won't fight you on that. Frankly, given tonight, I think having additional protection isn't the worst idea, however unconventional the arrangement." The meeting stretched on for another hour, details and logistics piling up faster than Lena could fully absorb, and by the time Agent Reyes finally left to coordinate with her team, exhaustion had settled over the entire room like a physical weight, thick and undeniable. Jack was the first to break the heavy silence that followed his handwriting, slower now, more tired, but no less resolute. "We're not staying here. Not another night. Too many people know we're in this building. Time to move somewhere they can't reach as easily." Reaper nodded his agreement immediately, already pulling out his phone to coordinate. And within another hour, a fresh, exhausted convoy had assembled once more this time, moving under the watchful eyes of federal agents as well as club members, a strange, uneasy alliance of the very different worlds that had collided so violently over the past 3 days. The drive back up into the mountains felt different this time. Not the tense, fear-driven urgency of the first trip, but something heavier. More grim, the weight of everything they now understood pressing down on the entire convoy as it wound its way back toward the compound that had in an impossibly short time come to feel less like a strange new world and more like the only place Lena could imagine feeling even remotely safe. Ruth met them again at the compound's entrance, her face tight with worry that hadn't fully eased even after Reaper's reassurances, and she pulled Lena into a brief, fierce hug the moment she stepped out of the SUV, an embrace that startled Lena with its intensity before she found herself sinking into it gratefully, the maternal warmth of it cutting through some of the raw, jagged fear still coursing through her body. Ruth pulled back and wrote quickly, "I heard what happened. Thank God you're both alive. Come inside. Everyone's been worried sick." The compound felt different, this time too fuller somehow. More people gathered in the main hall than Lena remembered from her first night, faces turning toward her and Jack both, as they entered, expressions ranging from relief to a kind of fierce protective anger. that Lena was beginning to understand was simply how this community expressed love not through soft words, but through an absolute unwavering readiness to fight for each other. Jack, exhausted as he clearly was, insisted on being wheeled through the main hall rather than taken directly to rest, and Lena watched as he greeted each person by name, gripping hands, exchanging brief quiet words that she couldn't hear, but could read clearly in the fierce gratitude and relief passing between him and every single member of his extended family. It was nearly dawn by the time the compound finally settled into something resembling quiet, and Lena found herself unable to sleep despite her bone-deep exhaustion, her mind replaying the assault on the hospital floor over and over, the silent chaos of it, the terrifying vulnerability of watching danger unfold without being able to hear it coming. She wandered out onto a small, covered porch attached to the guest quarters, wrapping her arms around herself against the pre-dawn chill, and found Jack already there, positioned in a wheelchair. Someone had brought him, staring out at the dark shapes of the mountains with an expression she couldn't quite read. He noticed her immediately, his eyes tracking her approach even in the dim light, and gestured toward the empty chair beside him with a small, tired smile. She sat, and for a long moment, neither of them reached for a notepad or attempted to communicate at all, simply existing together in the quiet aftermath of survival. And Lena found something strangely comforting in that shared silence, a silence that for once didn't feel isolating, didn't feel like exclusion from a world she couldn't fully access, but instead felt like companionship, like two people who had earned the right to simply sit together without needing words to fill the space between them. Eventually, Jack reached for the small notepad tucked into the side pocket of his wheelchair and wrote, his handwriting steadier now after some rest, though still marked by obvious fatigue. "Can I ask you something personal?" Lena nodded, curious despite her exhaustion, and he continued writing, his expression carrying a vulnerability she hadn't seen from him before, not even in the hospital. "Why'd you really run into that fire? Everyone keeps saying, because it was the right thing to do. But I don't think that's the whole truth. I've been around long enough to know when someone's got more going on beneath the surface." Lena considered the question for a long moment, surprised by how directly he'd asked. Surprised even more by her own impulse to answer honestly, rather than deflecting the way she usually did with people who tried to probe beneath her carefully maintained composure. She wrote slowly, choosing her words with care. "My whole life, people have decided what I'm capable of before I even get a chance to try. Deaf girl, they think. Fragile. Needs help. Can't be trusted with anything that matters. I've spent 22 years proving people wrong about that, and it never seems to stick because the next person just assumes the same things all over again." She paused, then continued, something loosening in her chest as she let the words spill out onto the paper. "When I saw that truck hit your convoy, when I saw everyone else just standing there frozen, I didn't think about danger. I thought about every single time in my life someone should have moved and didn't. Every time I was left waiting because somebody assumed I couldn't handle things myself. I wasn't going to be one more person standing still while someone needed help." Jack read this slowly, his expression shifting through several emotions Lena couldn't fully parse, before finally settling into something quiet and deeply moved. He wrote back, his handwriting slower now, more deliberate. "I lost my wife 11 years ago. Car accident, ironically enough, though, nothing like what happened on that highway. I watched people freeze then, to watch bystanders just stand there while I tried to get her out, and nobody moved fast enough. And by the time anyone did, it was already too late." Lena's chest tightened painfully as she read this, understanding immediately why the moment on the highway had struck something so deep in him, why his gratitude toward her carried such raw, unshakable weight beneath the surface. He continued writing, his hand trembling slightly now, though whether from exhaustion or emotion Lena couldn't tell. "When I saw you running toward that fire when everyone else was standing frozen, just like they did that day 11 years ago, something in me just broke wide open. You did what nobody did for her. I know it's not the same situation. I know you don't owe me any explanation for why you did what you did, but I need you to understand what it meant, what it still means." Lena felt tears prick sharply at her eyes, and she reached out instinctively, covering his large weathered hand with her smaller one, and for a long moment they simply sat together in that shared understanding. Two people who had both learned in different ways and through different tragedies exactly how much it cost to watch the world stand still when it should have moved. The moment was interrupted gently by Ruth stepping out onto the porch, her expression carrying the particular gravity of someone bringing news that couldn't wait for a better time, and she held up a folded piece of paper as she approached her movements, careful, almost hesitant. "Sorry to interrupt. Danny asked me to bring this straight to you both, said it couldn't wait." Jack took the paper, his expression tightening as he read it, and he passed it wordlessly to Lena. Once he'd finished, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. Lena's eyes scanned the printed message, and her stomach dropped as she absorbed what Danny had apparently discovered overnight while everyone else attempted to rest. Cross-referenced ownership records again. Found something we missed. The private security firm connected to the shell company isn't just contracted with local police departments. It's also connected through a holding company registered in Delaware to a hospital administration consulting firm. The same firm that handles risk management and staffing contracts for Verde Valley Medical Center. Which means whoever's behind this didn't just get lucky finding fake credentials to access the hospital. They may have had inside help arranging security gaps from the very beginning. Lena read it twice, feeling the ground shift beneath her, understanding once more the implications spiraling outward faster than she could fully process them. It wasn't just Miller. It wasn't even just cartel muscle and corrupted local law enforcement. Whoever sat at the top of this operation had reached deep enough to potentially compromise the very hospital that had treated both her and Jack, deep enough to have possibly known well in advance exactly how vulnerable they would both be in that building. She looked up at Jack, her hands shaking as she sighed, needing Ruth to translate now since Reaper wasn't present. How is this possible? How does someone have that much reach? Ruth, translating carefully, then added her own written note beneath the translation, her expression grim. "Money like that doesn't come from small operations, sweetheart. This isn't just cartel business anymore. This is something that's been building for a long time, quietly, patiently, through legitimate-looking channels most people would never think to question." Jack's expression had gone cold and focused in a way Lena hadn't seen since the confrontation with Miller, and he grabbed the notepad from Ruth to write his own response, his hands steady now, despite everything driven by a fresh, hardened resolve. "Then we go after the money. Not the muscle, not the corrupt cops, not even the cartel connections directly. We follow the financial trail all the way to whoever's actually profiting from this, and we make sure Agent Reyes has everything she needs to bring the whole structure down at once, instead of letting them just shuffle resources and rebuild somewhere else." Ruth nodded slowly, already turning to head back inside to relay the plan, but paused at the door, looking back at both of them with an expression that carried real fear beneath its steady composure. "Just be careful. Whoever these people are, they've already tried to kill both of you 3 times now. 4th time might not give us the warning the first 3 did." The words hung heavy in the pre-dawn air long after Ruth had disappeared back inside, and Lena found herself staring out at the darkened mountains at the first faint hints of gray beginning to soften the horizon, feeling the full, exhausting weight of everything still ahead of them. Jack's hand found hers again, firm and steady, despite his own obvious fatigue, and he squeezed once before releasing it to write one final note before the growing light of morning made the whiteboard unnecessary. "Whatever's coming next, we face it together. That's not just me talking as the man you saved. That's a promise from someone who's never once let his family stand alone against something trying to tear them apart." Lena read the words, then looked up to meet his eyes, directly understanding with sudden, startling clarity that somewhere over these past 3 impossible days, she had stopped being merely a witness caught up in someone else's war and had become something else entirely. Not just protected, but genuinely fiercely claimed as family by a man in a community that asked nothing of her except the honesty and courage she'd already proven she possessed in abundance. She nodded, unable to fully articulate everything she was feeling, and simply signed 2 words that needed no elaborate translation at all. "Together, always." Behind them inside the compound, the day's preparations were already beginning, voices and movement picking up as word spread of Danny's discovery and the new direction their fight would need to take. But for just a few more moments, sitting together on that quiet porch, as dawn finally broke properly over the mountains, Lena allowed herself to simply breathe, to feel the solid, unwavering presence of the man beside her, and to hold on to the fragile, hard-won hope that whatever monstrous, far-reaching conspiracy they were up against, they would face it exactly as he'd promised, together and not alone. But even as that hope settled warm in her chest, a darker thought lingered at its edges, refusing to be fully silenced. Whoever sat at the top of this operation had already proven 3 times over a willingness to reach into hospitals, into police departments, into the most supposedly secure spaces imaginable, all to eliminate two people who had simply refused to stay quiet. And if Danny's discovery was accurate, if this truly reached as high and as wide as the paper trail suggested, then the war that had started on a lonely desert highway was only just beginning to show its true terrifying scope. Danny found them within the hour, laptop already open. His eyes red from lack of sleep but sharp with the particular energy of someone who had finally broken through something that mattered. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just turned the screen toward Jack and Lena, both his hands moving fast across the keys as he pulled up a tangled web of financial connections that had taken him most of the night to untangle. Reaper appeared behind him, reading over his shoulder, and his face went still in a way that made Lena's stomach tighten before anyone had written a single word for her benefit. Danny finally looked up and wrote quickly, his handwriting cramped with urgency, followed the money through 6 more shell layers. It all converges on a single holding entity, registered to a man named Gerald Whitfield, real estate developer on paper. Sits on the board of 2 hospital administration firms, including the one that manages Verde Valley Medical Center's staffing contracts. Also, and this is the part that matters most, he's a major donor to the county sheriff's re-election campaign and sat on the civilian oversight board that approved Miller's promotion 3 years ago. Lena read the name twice, feeling something cold settle into her chest. This wasn't cartel muscle anymore, wasn't corrupted local officers taking bribes to look the other way. This was a man who had built himself into the very institutions meant to provide oversight and protection, using that position to shield an operation that had already tried to kill her 3 times. Jack's jaw tightened as Reaper translated, and he grabbed the whiteboard, his handwriting hard and pressed deep into the surface. This is our target, not Miller, not the cartel muscle. This man is the reason all of it kept moving no matter how many pieces we knocked down. Reaper nodded grimly and added his own note beneath it. Agent Reyes needs this immediately. But we need to be smart about how we move. A man with this kind of institutional reach will have warning systems in place. The second we tip our hand, he'll either run or bury everything so deep we never surface it again. Danny was already composing the message, his fingers flying, and within minutes, he'd sent the entire trail of financial documentation directly to Agent Reyes's secure line, flagging it urgent, watching the screen for confirmation of receipt with a tension that mirrored everyone else's in the room. The reply came faster than Lena expected, and Danny read it aloud for Reaper to translate in real time. She says this matches independent leads her team's been developing. Whitfield's been on their radar for financial irregularities for months, but nobody had connected him directly to the cartel operation until now. She's requesting an emergency meeting with Jack and Lena both this afternoon at a secure federal location. Says this could be the piece that finally lets them move on all of it at once. Jack's expression reading the translation carried a complicated mixture of relief and wariness, and he wrote back slowly, where, and who else knows about this location? Danny relayed the question and received a response within moments, his expression easing slightly as he read it. Federal building in Phoenix. Agent Reyes says only her direct team knows the details. Nobody local. Nobody who could have any connection to Whitfield's network. Reaper still looked uneasy, his eyes flicking toward Jack with an unspoken question, and Jack, reading his expression easily after years of partnership, nodded once firm and decisive. We go. Careful, but we go. If this is our shot to end this cleanly, we take it. The drive to Phoenix that afternoon carried a different weight than any of the convoys before it, not fleeing danger this time, but moving deliberately toward the confrontation that would one way or another determine whether the nightmare that had begun on Highway 87 would finally end or simply mutate into something even harder to fight. Lena sat beside Jack in the back of the lead SUV, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the desert blur past the window and trying to steady the anxious thrum beneath her ribs. Jack, noticing her tension, reached over and covered her hands with his own, and though neither of them wrote anything, the simple solid weight of his hand said more than words could have anyway. They arrived at the federal building to find Agent Reyes waiting for them personally at a secure side entrance, her expression carrying a focused intensity that told Lena, even before any words were exchanged, that whatever they were about to discuss carried enormous weight. She led them through a series of checkpoints and into a conference room already occupied by 2 other agents, both of whom rose as Jack's wheelchair entered, their expressions carrying the same grave seriousness as Reyes's own. Once seated, Reyes turned directly to Lena and began writing immediately, apparently having prepared for this conversation with Lena's communication needs firmly in mind. Miss Carter, what you and your associates uncovered gives us the final piece we needed. We're prepared to move on Gerald Whitfield and the entire network connected to him within the next 48 hours. But we need something from you first. Lena's stomach tightened, and she wrote back cautiously, "What do you need?" Reyes's expression softened slightly, though the gravity in her eyes didn't diminish. "We need your formal testimony on record about exactly what you witnessed on that highway. Whitfield's lawyers are going to challenge every piece of financial evidence we have, argue it's circumstantial, argue it proves nothing about intent. But an eyewitness account of a deliberate planned collision combined with the financial trail, that's what actually closes this case in court. I won't sugarcoat it. Once your testimony is on record, once your name is attached to this case publicly, you become an even bigger target than you already are." Lena felt Jack's hand tighten around hers, and she looked over to find him watching her with an expression that held no pressure, no expectation, only a quiet, fierce respect for whatever choice she was about to make. She thought about every moment of the last several days, the fire, the fake nurse with her syringe, the assault on the hospital floor, Miller's chilling warning that this went deeper than any of them realized. She thought about the surgery she still needed, the life she'd been trying so hard to hold on to before any of this had ever happened, the life that felt impossibly distant, now buried beneath layers of danger and violence she'd never asked for. But she also thought about every moment in her life she'd been told to wait, to stay quiet, to let someone else handle things, because surely a deaf girl couldn't manage something this big, this dangerous, this important. She thought about the people on that highway who had frozen instead of moving, in the quiet, burning certainty that had driven her toward that fire instead of away from it. She wrote, her hands steady despite everything. "I'll testify, whatever it takes to make sure this ends and nobody else gets hurt, because people like Whitfield think they can buy their way out of consequences." Jack's grip on her hand tightened further. And though he said nothing, the pride and fierce protectiveness in his expression needed no translation at all. Reyes nodded slowly, clearly, moved by the answer despite her professional composure, and continued outlining the plan. "We'll move fast. Arrest warrants execute simultaneously across multiple locations tomorrow morning, time to prevent anyone from being tipped off and destroying evidence or fleeing. You'll give your formal statement today, here in this secure location, and then we move you to protective custody until the arrests are complete and the immediate danger has passed." The formal statement took nearly 3 hours, an interpreter brought in specifically for the occasion, working alongside Lena's own careful, deliberate signing as she walked federal investigators through every detail of that terrible afternoon on the highway, the strange pacing of the box truck alongside the motorcycles, the sudden violent turn, the fire, every moment of running toward danger instead of away from it. By the time it finished, Lena felt wrung out completely. Exhaustion settling deep into her bones in a way that had nothing to do with physical injury and everything to do with the emotional weight of reliving the worst day of her life in exacting, methodical detail for the official record. Jack, watching her throughout the process, had grown increasingly restless. Himself, his own exhaustion and lingering injuries clearly wearing on him, despite his effort to hide it. And when the statement finally concluded, Reyes allowed them both a brief moment to rest before continuing with logistics. It was during that quiet moment alone in a small side office, while Reyes coordinated with her team down the hall, that Reaper burst through the door, his face carrying an urgency that immediately snapped both Jack and Lena to full alertness. He didn't bother with the whiteboard, just signed fast and rough his imperfect but increasingly practiced signs, conveying the emergency clearly enough. "Whitfield knows. Somebody tipped him off. He's already moving assets, and worse, he's got people watching this building." Jack was on his feet immediately despite his injuries, his expression hardening into the same cold focus Lena had seen during the hospital assault, and he grabbed the notepad to write fast. "How do you know?" Reaper's answer came just as fast, his handwriting jagged with urgency. Danny intercepted a call. Whitfield's private security chief talking to someone about handling the Carter situation before it goes any further. They know she's here. They know what she's about to do. Lena's blood ran cold, the fragile sense of security she'd felt inside this federal building evaporating instantly. And she signed with trembling hands, "How this place is supposed to be secure." Reaper's expression when Jack translated the question carried a grim answer that settled like a stone in Lena's stomach. Reyes said only her direct team knew the location. which means either someone inside that team isn't as clean as she thinks, or Whitfield's reach goes even deeper than any of us realized. The door burst open again, this time revealing Agent Reyes herself. Her professional composure cracked just enough to reveal genuine alarm beneath it, and she spoke fast, gesturing for them to follow immediately, even before Reaper could finish translating for Lena's benefit. "We need to move you right now. I don't know how, but Whitfield's people know your location. I've got a secure transport ready, but we need to go this instant." The next several minutes blurred into a chaotic rush of movement, federal agents surrounding them in a tight, protective formation. Jack's wheelchair pushed at a near run, despite his protests that he could walk if it meant moving faster. Reaper's hand never leaving Lena's arm as they moved through hallways and stairwells toward an underground parking structure where an armored transport vehicle waited with engine already running. They had just cleared the final checkpoint, agents scanning the parking structure with weapons drawn, when Lena felt Reaper's grip on her arm tighten suddenly, violently, and she followed his gaze to see a dark sedan parked at an angle near the structure's exit that hadn't been there 30 minutes earlier. Its windows tinted too dark to see inside its position, blocking exactly the route their transport needed to take. Agent Reyes saw it at the same moment, her hand moving instantly to her weapon, and she barked orders. Lena couldn't hear, but could read clearly in the sudden, sharp reorganization of the agents around them, half moving to flank the suspicious vehicle, while the rest formed a tighter shield around Jack and Lena. The sedan's engine roared to life, and for one terrifying heartbeat, Lena thought it would charge directly at them, but instead it peeled away, fast tires screeching against concrete, disappearing up the parking structure's exit ramp before any of the agents could get close enough to stop it. Reyes's radio crackled with something, and her expression when she turned back to the group carried a mixture of relief and renewed urgency. "They're gone, but that confirms it. They had eyes on this building. We need to change our transport route completely right now, and I mean completely off any plan we discussed inside." The drive that followed felt like nothing Lena had experienced yet, even amid everything that had already happened. Reyes personally directing the driver through a series of sudden, unpredictable turns, designed specifically to shake any potential tail agents in the vehicle, constantly scanning mirrors and side streets with a tension that kept Lena's heart hammering the entire way. It was nearly an hour later, after doubling back twice and switching vehicles once in an underground garage that Lena hadn't even known existed until they pulled into it, that Reyes finally allowed herself to relax slightly, confirming through her radio that they'd successfully lost any pursuit. They arrived at a nondescript safe house on the outskirts of the city as evening settled over the desert, and it was only once they were fully secured inside, doors locked, agents positioned at every entrance, that Reyes finally addressed the elephant hovering over the entire operation. She wrote directly to Lena, her expression grave. "I need to be honest with you. Someone leaked your location today. I don't yet know who, but I intend to find out, and until I do, I can't guarantee the same security failure won't happen again, which means we may need to move faster on the arrest than originally planned before Whitfield has time to fully mobilize whatever resources he's still got access to." Jack, reading the translation Reaper provided, grabbed the notepad with a fierce, decisive energy that cut through his obvious exhaustion. "Then move tonight. Don't wait for tomorrow morning. Every hour we give him is another hour for him to disappear or destroy evidence or hurt someone else." Reyes considered this for a long moment, clearly weighing operational risk against the mounting danger of delay, before finally nodding, already reaching for her phone to coordinate with her team. "You're right, I'll push for tonight. But that means everyone needs to stay exactly where they are until I confirm the arrests are complete. No exceptions." The next several hours passed in an agonizing, tension-filled wait. Lena curled into a corner of the safe house's small living room with Jack beside her, both of them too wired with adrenaline and worry to sleep, despite the exhaustion pressing down on every muscle in their bodies. Reaper paced near the window, checking his phone constantly, and Danny had set up his laptop on the kitchen table, monitoring what news feeds he could access for any sign of movement on Whitfield's network. His face lit blue in the darkness, tense and focused. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Reyes finally returned, and the moment Lena saw her face, saw the visible, hard-won relief written across every line of her expression. Something in Lena's own chest finally cautiously began to unclench. Reyes crossed the room and wrote quickly, her hand slightly unsteady, with the aftermath of what had clearly been a tense operation on her end too. "It's done. Whitfield's in custody. So are 4 of his top associates, including the security chief." who ordered the surveillance on the federal building today. We also picked up 2 men connected to the shell company and local police. The uncompromised officers this time arrested the driver of the box truck who's already talking, trying to cut a deal by giving up everything he knows about the operation structure. Lena read the words 3 times before she fully allowed herself to believe them, tears blurring her vision as the weight of days upon days of terror finally genuinely began to lift from her shoulders. Jack beside her let out a long, shuddering breath, and he reached for the notepad with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from exhaustion or emotion, Lena couldn't tell anymore, the two having become so thoroughly tangled together over the past several days that she doubted even he could separate them clearly. Is Miller in custody too? Reyes nodded, adding beneath it, along with 2 other officers who were taking payments from the same network. Full corruption investigation is already underway within the department. This isn't just closing one case, Mr. Mason. This is dismantling an entire operation that's been quietly poisoning multiple institutions for years. The relief that flooded through the small, safe house living room was almost physical in its intensity. Reaper finally lowering himself into a chair. For the first time in hours, Danny closing his laptop with a long, exhausted exhale, and Jack, despite everything his body had endured, pulling Lena into a careful, one-armed embrace that she sank into, completely feeling for the first time in what felt like an eternity, something close to actual safety settle over her. But even as relief washed through the room, Reyes' expression carried a lingering caution that kept Lena from fully releasing her guard. She wrote one final note before allowing herself to sit down for the first time since arriving. The immediate threat is neutralized, but there will be a trial, and that means public testimony, media attention, all of it. Whitfield's lawyers will fight this hard, and there may still be people connected to this network who weren't caught in tonight's arrests. I won't tell you the danger's completely gone, but tonight, right now, you are both safe, and that operation that's been hunting you for days no longer has the resources or the freedom to keep trying. It was enough. After everything, it was more than enough, and Lena allowed herself finally to close her eyes and rest against Jack's shoulder, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting for what felt like a lifetime, compressed into a handful of impossible days. The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange, disorienting mixture of relief and lingering vigilance. Lena remained at the mountain compound during the trial preparations, surrounded by a community that had, against every expectation she'd carried into this ordeal, become something she was increasingly reluctant to leave behind. Ruth taught her to cook over the compound's massive outdoor grill, patient and warm, despite Lena's initial clumsiness with unfamiliar recipes. Danny continued teaching himself sign language in the evenings, his vocabulary growing steadily until conversations between them no longer required a notepad at all for simple exchanges. Reaper, gruff and protective as ever, had appointed himself something between bodyguard and older brother, a role Lena found herself genuinely grateful for rather than merely tolerating. And Jack, recovering slowly but steadily from his injuries, spent increasing amounts of time simply sitting with her in the evenings, their conversations growing easier and more natural with each passing day. Notepads and whiteboards gradually supplemented by Jack's own halting attempts to learn basic signs, his large, weathered hands clumsy but earnest as he practiced simple phrases just to communicate with her more directly. It was during one of those quiet evenings, nearly a month after the arrest, that Lena first noticed the change in her own body that she'd been dreading for weeks. A stumble crossing the compound's main yard, sharper and more pronounced than any she'd experienced before, her right leg buckling entirely for one terrifying moment before Jack's quick reflexes, despite his own still healing injuries, caught her before she hit the ground. The specialist Ruth arranged for her to see, driving nearly 2 hours to a private clinic that could maintain the discretion their situation still required, delivered news that settled like a stone in Lena's chest, even though she'd known somewhere beneath the surface that it was coming. Your condition has progressed faster than we'd hoped, given the trauma your body's endured recently. The doctor wrote, his expression carrying genuine sympathy. Without the surgery, and honestly sooner rather than later, you're looking at permanent loss of mobility in that leg within the next several months, possibly both legs eventually. Lena rode back to the compound in near silence, staring out the window at the passing desert, the surgery's price tag still impossibly cruelly out of reach, despite everything else that had changed in her life, settling over her like a fresh, exhausting weight. She had survived cartel assassins and corrupt detectives and an explosion that should have killed her. She was not, she thought with a bitter, exhausted kind of irony, going to be defeated by a hospital billing department. Jack noticed her mood the moment she returned, and though she tried to deflect his questions, at first writing vague reassurances on the notepad, he immediately produced his patient. Steady insistence eventually wore through her resistance, and she found herself explaining everything. The surgery, the couchage, the timeline the doctor had given her, the particular exhaustion of having fought so hard for her life, only to face losing her mobility to something as mundane and unglamorous as insurance limitations and impossible medical bills. Jack listened to the translation without interrupting his expression, growing increasingly still, and focused in a way Lena had learned over the past month to recognize as the specific look he wore when he was already formulating a plan rather than simply reacting to bad news. When she finished, he wrote a single line, his handwriting firm and absolute. "Give me a week." Lena, exhausted and frankly too worn down to argue, simply nodded, not fully understanding what he intended, but too tired to press for details that evening. Over the following days, she noticed a shift in the compound's energy, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, Reaper and Danny disappearing for hours at a time on errands. Nobody fully explained, Jack himself spending long stretches on the phone, his expression carrying a focused determination that reminded her in an entirely different context of the same fierce resolve he'd shown fighting for his life on that burning highway. It was Ruth who finally let something slip, catching Lena's questioning look one afternoon as another group of unfamiliar motorcycles rolled into the compound, riders Lena didn't recognize greeting Jack's people with the easy familiarity of old friends rather than strangers. Ruth wrote a small, knowing smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Jack's calling in favors. Every chapter that owes him something, every brother who remembers what he's done for them over 30 years, they're all being asked the same question right now, Lena signed, confused. What question? Ruth's smile widened slightly before she wrote her answer. Whether family means something or whether it's just words on a patch. Exactly 1 week after Jack had asked for that time, Lena woke to find the compound's main yard filled with more motorcycles than she had ever seen gathered in one place. Engines she couldn't hear but could feel rumbling through the ground itself as riders continued arriving throughout the morning. Dozens, becoming hundreds, patches from chapters spanning states she'd never even visited, all converging on this single mountain compound with a purpose Lena still didn't fully understand. Jack found her on the porch, watching the spectacle unfold with growing bewilderment, and he settled into the chair beside her, his own expression carrying something Lena hadn't seen from him before, a kind of fierce, quiet pride mixed with genuine, unguarded emotion. He handed her the notepad, and this time his handwriting was steady, certain, carrying none of the exhaustion or urgency of their previous exchanges. "We're going to Los Angeles today, all of us. Every single person you see out there. We're going to that hospital and we're paying for your surgery in full today." Lena stared at the words, her mind struggling to fully process the scale of what he was telling her, and she looked up at him, her hands shaking as she signed, "How this is $150,000, Jack. I know what that costs. I've done the math 1,000 times. Jack's answer when it came carried a weight and certainty that settled deep into Lena's chest, unraveling something that had been knotted tight inside her for years. 30 years of loyalty adds up to more than you'd think. Every man out there today owes me something, whether it's money or a favor, or just the simple fact that I never once turned my back on family when it mattered. Today I'm calling in every bit of it, not for me, but for you. Because you ran into fire for a stranger without hesitating for 1 single second, and every person out there in that yard understands exactly what that kind of courage means, because most of us have lived our whole lives being underestimated too. The convoy that departed the compound less than an hour later stretched for what felt like miles along the highway. Hundreds of motorcycles moving in careful, disciplined formation, drawing stunned, curious looks from every car they passed. Cell phones raised to capture footage of a procession unlike anything most bystanders had likely ever witnessed. Lena rode in the SUV near the convoy's center, Jack beside her, and she watched through the window as the desert blurred past, as strangers pulled to the shoulder, simply to watch the sheer scale of the procession move by. And something about witnessing this outpouring of loyalty and love, mobilized entirely on her behalf, brought fresh tears to her eyes that she made no effort to hide. They arrived at the private medical center in Los Angeles just past noon, and the sight of hundreds of motorcycles filling the surrounding streets, engines finally cutting to silence, as riders dismounted in unison, drew immediate wide-eyed attention from hospital staff and security, who clearly had no framework for processing what was unfolding outside their doors. Jack, moving with the aid of a cane now, rather than the wheelchair he'd needed just weeks before, led a small delegation inside himself. Reaper, Ruth, and Lena, along with two club members. Lena didn't fully recognize who she would learn shortly held business degrees and had spent the past week working with Jack's attorney to arrange every detail of what was about to happen. The hospital administrator, who met them initially wary and visibly unsettled by the sheer number of leather-clad bikers now occupying her lobby, transformed rapidly once Jack's representatives laid out exactly what they'd come to do. A certified check already prepared, covering the entire cost of Lena's surgery in full, along with additional funds earmarked for her recovery care and physical therapy. The administrator, reading through the documentation with growing disbelief, finally looked up at Jack directly, and though Lena couldn't hear the question, she could read it clearly enough in the woman's stunned expression. Jack's response, once translated for Lena's benefit by Reaper, carried a simplicity that struck her more deeply than any grand declaration could have. "She saved my life without asking for anything in return. This isn't charity. This is a debt being paid exactly as it should be." The surgery was scheduled for the following week. The specialist Lena had originally consulted, brought in specifically to lead the procedure once word reached him that funding was impossibly no longer an obstacle, and Lena spent the days leading up to it surrounded by more support than she had known in her entire life. Ruth staying close throughout every appointment, Jack present for consultations despite his own ongoing recovery. Reaper and Danny taking turns keeping her distracted with card games and increasingly competent conversations in sign language that no longer required a notepad at all. The morning of the surgery arrived with a strange, quiet calm settling over Lena. Months of fear and uncertainty finally narrowing down to this single decisive moment. Jack sat with her in the pre-operative room, his large hand wrapped around hers, and though neither of them wrote anything, the steady warmth of his presence said everything that needed saying. The surgery itself took nearly 6 hours, and Lena would remember almost nothing of it beyond the anesthesia settling over her and the last image she carried into unconsciousness. Jack's face steady and certain, watching over her with the same fierce protectiveness he'd shown from the very first moment their lives had collided on that burning desert highway. She woke, slowly disoriented, her body aching in unfamiliar ways, and the first thing she registered, clearly blinking against the recovery room's bright lights, was Jack's face hovering close, his expression carrying a raw, unguarded relief that told her before any words were exchanged that everything had gone exactly as hoped. The recovery that followed stretched across several difficult weeks, physical therapy sessions, pushing her body through pain and frustration in equal measure. But with each passing day, Lena felt something shifting beneath the surface of her own determination. Not just healing, but a fundamental restoration of balance and stability that she had feared for years now might never return. It was nearly 3 months after the surgery, on a clear, bright morning back at the mountain compound, that Lena finally stood at the edge of the main yard watching the sunrise paint the surrounding mountains in soft gold, and took a slow, deliberate step forward without a single moment of wavering, without the familiar, dreaded lurch of her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. She kept walking steady and sure out toward the center of the yard where Jack stood waiting, having watched her entire slow, careful progress with an expression of such profound pride and relief that it brought fresh tears to Lena's eyes even as she smiled through them. She reached him, and he pulled her into an embrace, careful of her still healing body, but firm and certain nonetheless. And when he finally pulled back to look at him, his weathered face carried an expression of such complete, unguarded joy that Lena found herself laughing through her tears, a sound she couldn't hear but could feel resonating through her own chest, warm and alive and utterly unbroken. He signed slowly, carefully, using vocabulary he'd spent months practicing specifically for this moment. "You are standing." Lena signed back, her hands steady, her heart fuller than she had ever imagined possible after everything they'd survived together. "I'm standing. Because of you. Because of all of you." Jack shook his head firmly and signed it with a certainty that needed no translation, no interpretation, nothing beyond the simple, absolute truth carried in every movement of his hands. "No, because of you. You ran into fire first." Around them, the compound stirred to life with the ordinary rhythms of morning, Ruth calling everyone toward breakfast, Reaper and Danny already deep in easy, familiar conversation nearby, the entire community that had become, against every expectation Lena had carried into this impossible journey, her true and unshakable family. She could not hear the engines that had carried hundreds of riders across state lines simply because loyalty demanded it. She could not hear the laughter drifting across the yard, or the wind moving through the pines surrounding the compound, or any of the countless sounds that filled the world she'd always been separate from. But she felt all of it deep in her chest, in the steady rhythm of her own 2 feet finally fully beneath her, in the warmth of Jack's hands still holding hers, in the unbreakable bond of a family that had chosen her every bit as fiercely as she had once chosen to run toward their fire without a single moment of hesitation. Silence, she understood now, standing steady and whole in the golden morning light, had never been her weakness. It had simply been waiting all these years for a world worth standing strong within. And she had finally found it.